This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Well, hello, it's Lewis Goodall sitting in for James O'Brien all this week, and every day it really feels like 2017 to me. Why do I say that? Well, because every single day you wake up as a British journalist and you think and you expect and you perhaps even dare to hope that you might be able to focus on something other than what was in Donald Trump's brain, which soon emerged from Donald Trump's brain at some point when you went to sleep overnight. But unfortunately, I think pretty much every day this week so far, from Monday to Wednesday, we have not been able to do anything but avoid that fate. Because Donald Trump has perhaps gone even better than what he'd said earlier in the week. He's gone better than allowing Elon Musk to take over various different bits of the American federal government apparatus. He's gone one better than suggesting that he would impose tariffs on his closest economic neighbours and restructuring the world economic order. He's decided to turn his attention to the Middle East and a plan, a Trump doctrine, a Trump peace plan. And I thought I could do worse this morning by reading you the first few paragraphs of the New York Times reporting on what happened at that press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, overnight, because each paragraph becomes more shocking, more extraordinary, more remarkable than the last. Choose your superlative at will. President Trump, the New York Times writes, declared on Tuesday that the United States should seize control of Gaza and permanently displace the entire Palestinian population of the devastated enclave, one of the most brazen ideas that any American leader has advanced in years. Hosting Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel at the White House, Mr. Trump said that all 2 million Palestinians from Gaza should be moved to countries like Egypt and Jordan because of the devastation wrought by Israel's campaign against Hamas after the terrorist attack of October the 7th, 2023. While the president framed the matter as a humanitarian imperative and an economic development opportunity, he effectively reopened a geopolitical Pandora's box with far-reaching implications for the Middle East. Control over Gaza has been one of the major flashpoints of the Arab-Israeli conflict for decades, and the idea of relocating its Palestinian residents recalls an era where great Western powers redrew the maps of the region and moved around populations without regard to local autonomy. Pandora's box is, I think, exactly the opposite phrase. Let us listen to a clip, an extract of what Trump said, standing alongside the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the first foreign leader to visit him as a newly re-elected president, reinstalled at the White House overnight.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area.
What authority would allow you to do that? Are you talking about a permanent occupation there?
I do see a long-term ownership position, and I see it bringing great stability to that part of the Middle East and maybe the entire Middle East. And everybody I've spoken to, this was not a decision made lightly. Everybody I've spoken to loves the idea of the United States owning that piece of land, developing and creating thousands of jobs with something that will be magnificent in a really magnificent area that nobody would know. Nobody can look because all they see is death and destruction.
I mentioned again tonight our 3 goals, and the third goal is to make sure that Gaza never poses a threat to Israel again. President Trump is taking it to a much higher level. He sees a different future for that piece of land that has been the focus of so much terrorism, so many attacks against us, so many trials and so many tribulations. He has a different idea. And I think it's worth paying attention to this.
That was Donald Trump speaking alongside the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House overnight. This has, make no mistake, sent shockwaves across the Middle East and around the world. Trump has upended single-handedly in the matter of a few sentences many of the assumptions and policy axioms of US foreign policy, which have guided presidents both Democratic and Republican for many decades. And though you might say, well, this is what Trump does. Trump often is a maverick. He does things differently. He thinks outside the box. In this case, I have to say, I don't think the box is in the same solar system that President Trump is currently inhabiting. And that all may be true. But it is also true to say that this speaks to, let's leave aside and come back to the actual practicalities of this in a moment and actually why it wouldn't work. One thing I think it does remind us, something I've been saying for a little while, even said a couple of days ago on this show. This reminds us that Trump, too, is operating in a very different psychological mindset to Trump 1. The mindset of Trump 1, Trump in his first presidency, was profoundly isolationist, if anything. He wanted to avoid foreign entanglements wherever he could, in particular in the Middle East, which he saw as expensive, as having the potential to bog America down. He was uninterested in war. In fact, he ran explicitly, as to some extent he even did in this most recent election, as the anti-war candidate, the anti-American imperial candidate. Let us look after ourselves at home, bound by the two great oceans of the Atlantic and the Pacific. That has a great and long-established element. That is a great and long-established element within the American psyche and American political history. Trump, too, is quite different. Trump, too, is no longer isolationist. Quite the contrary. He's expansionist. Let us consider what we're talking about here. Trump is not even saying, and it's not clear what authority he would be acting on here. It certainly wouldn't be under the UN authority or anything like that. Certainly not, I think, under the aegis of international law. He is saying that the United States won't just oversee an international force, a coalition acting nominally on behalf of the UN, as America did to some extent, at least they claim to, during the Iraq War. He's saying that the US would unilaterally go into Gaza and own Gaza, that they would redevelop Gaza, that they would force Gazans from their homes because that is in the interest, long-term interest of the Middle East. This is a profoundly expansionist and imperial mindset, quite different to the thing that we saw in Trump's first term, where he largely wanted, in foreign affairs matters, to mind his own business. This is a Trump who is looking for new enemies abroad, for new conquests abroad, for new tasks abroad, because he has so comprehensively vanquished his enemies at home. And Trump's politics is a politics which relies on enemies, foreign and domestic, on aggression, on new conquests, one way or the other. I think Trump one wouldn't have thought twice, wouldn't have thought at all about saying something like this. At the very, he would have simply looked at the price tag, if nothing else, and found it an appalling prospect. This is a very different Trump. This is a Trump looking for a legacy. And let's turn and think about actually the practicalities of all of this. Now, on the one hand, you can say, and I think it's fair to say, that, well, look, the current situation clearly is not working. We've had year after year after year, decade after decade of Western politicians talking blithely about a Western peace plan or a two-state solution, and it never ever happens. We've allowed Israelis and the Israeli government to continue to settle illegally, making the prospect of a two-state solution ever more remote. You can also say, and I don't say this to back anything that Trump has done or said up at all, you can also say that although this seems extraordinary, if you take a longer historical view, it's certainly true that the borders of the Middle East and the borders of Europe have often been punctuated and marked by big population transfers in order to make nation states work. We saw that with Greece and Turkey at the start of the 20th century. We saw it in extraordinary numbers and to an extraordinary extent after the Second World War. But my word, have we not learnt our lessons from those things? What they are and what they were colonial. They reeked of imperial power, and they caused heartache, despair, and ethnic tension, which in many cases still lingers to this day. And you add on top of that the particular history that the Palestinian people already have with forced relocation, with foreign powers telling them that they can no longer live here, they must live here, ever smaller, ever diminishing enclaves of territory that they must have. They call it the Nakba in Palestine, the catastrophe, when they look back at 1948, the establishment of Israel, and the fact that many of them were forced off their ancestral lands. All of this Trump plan, will be evocative of that catastrophe and will doubtless send shockwaves through the Gazan population and wider Palestine, because they will think that the United States has played its hand and showed which side comprehensively it's on. They will draw the dots, I think, between what has been going on in Israel in terms of the attacks over the last 14 months and now this, and see it as part, whether it is or not, and see it as part of a wider plan to force them from their homes, which it would seem to me likely only has the likelihood of empowering Hamas once again, who will be able to say, we are the last defenders, the last redoubt, the last line in the sand between you and the Americans and the Israelis coming along, invading and forcing you from their homes. Although forcing them where? Forcing them where? Because Trump said overnight that Jordan will take them and that neighbouring states will take them, Egypt will take them. Those countries didn't even want to take the Gazans when they were being bombed to bits, let alone now. So the practicalities are obviously in so many ways nonsense. But just because the practicalities are nonsense and only exist in the exigencies of Donald Trump's head does not mean that what he said, the power of his words, does not mean that they will travel. What would happen to Gaza under this plan? Well, this is something that was asked or put to the president by CNN last night in that press conference. Let's listen to what he said.
Katie,
follow
go
up
ahead.
on what you were saying there.
Say it. Go ahead, please.
Just to follow up on what you were saying about the Gazans leaving Gaza, going to other countries. One, where exactly are you suggesting that they should go? And two, are you saying they should return after it's rebuilt? And if not, who do you envision living there?
I envision world people living there, the world's people. I think you'll make that into an international, unbelievable place. I think the potential in the Gaza Strip is unbelievable. And I think the entire world, representatives from all over the world will be there, and they'll live there. Palestinians also. Palestinians will live there. Many people will live there. But they've tried the other, and they've tried it for decades and decades and decades. It's not going to work. It didn't work. It will never work. And you have to learn from history. History has, you just can't let it keep repeating itself. We have an opportunity to do something that could be phenomenal. And I don't want to be cute. I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East, this could be something that could be so bad. This could be so magnificent. But more importantly than that is the people that have been absolutely destroyed that live there now can live in peace in a much better situation, because they're living in hell. And those people will now be able to live in peace. We'll make sure that it's done world class. It'll be wonderful for the people. Palestinians mostly we're talking about. And I have a feeling that despite them saying no, I have a feeling that the king in Jordan and that the general president, but that the general in Egypt will open their hearts and will give us the kind of land that we need to get this done, and people can live in harmony and in peace. Thank you all very much.
Donald Trump there suggesting he thinks that Gaza could be the Riviera of the Middle East. I suppose I want to talk to you today, and we're going to be giving this full coverage. Doubtless it's going to come up at PMQs after 12 today, which will of course take live as usual on the show. Keir Starmer will be forced to make it clear what he thinks about this plan, if that's what you can call it. But also want to talk to you about what you think the effect of this will be. What is in Trump's mind? There are people out there who are saying that this is tantamount to ethnic cleansing, or the policy, if it was enacted, would be tantamount to ethnic cleansing. Even if that is the impression, let's leave aside whether or not it would be or not, even if that is the impression that is left, what effect will that have on the extremely fragile, hanging by the most slender of threads, ceasefire which is holding between Hamas and between Israel? And by the way, of course, everyone would recognize Hamas has to be dealt with. Of course they do. I mean, they've been obviously severely militarily degraded over the last 12 months or so, but they have to be dealt with. They cannot be a player in this way in the future of the Middle East. But is this really the way to do it? And is this the way to win over Palestinian hearts and minds? 0345 6060 973 0345 6060 973 for your thoughts on all of this, whether we should take it seriously, and if so, what effect it will have. You're listening to Lewis Goodall here, sitting in for James O'Brien all this week on LBC. The time is 10:18.
James O'Brien on LBC.
just coming up to 10:21. Let's get to your thoughts on all of this extraordinary developments from Washington overnight. Let's start with Ronnie, who's in Hartford. Ronnie.
Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, this is not the solution, but I do welcome the attempt, an out-of-left-field attempt to break the impasse on what is, the most intractable political problem that I think in the world today. I think of Yitzhak Rabin and Anwar Sadat especially, who are perhaps the only two people who have tried to break with their past and to move things on. And the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt has held since 1979.
Yes.
Sadat, who had originally been a supporter of Nazi Germany, and indeed had obviously led the Yom Kippur War, the Egyptian invasion initially of Israel, he decided that he'd had enough of bloodshed, as indeed Yitzhak Rabin did. They both paid with their lives. Later, they were assassinated by fanatics within their own group. But obviously, this is not the solution, Trump's solution. But I like the idea of grand conceptual attempts to start the conversation.
Well, it's certainly true, as I said,
Funnily enough, I don't regard the idea of population transfer as crazy. I would have a different view. I would like to see any solution must give something to the Israelis and something to the Palestinians. Trump's solution gives nothing to the Palestinians. I would like... In terms of population transfer, ideally, I would like every single last Israeli settler in the West Bank to be moved. Perhaps, I don't care where they go. They can go to Mars as far as I'm concerned, but they could go to Gaza.
Well, Ronnie,
the entire Gaza population could go to an expanded West Bank.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
No, not at all. I think, but yeah, of course. I mean, we should be up. You raise an important point, which is that, look, if in a two-state solution, there would doubtless be some population transfer. There would have to be, because, as you allude to, and you say, we've had a lot of illegal Israeli settlement. That doubtless wouldn't be conducive, or it wouldn't be what the Palestinians would accept. Therefore, inevitably there will be some population transfer. So it's not as if we can say, or would say, or certainly I'm not saying, that population transfer is always wrong in all circumstances. But on this scale, I mean, what Trump is saying is basically removing the whole of the Gaza Strip. As you say, that doesn't get you anywhere, because why would the Palestinians ever accept that?
Correct. Yes, I mean, certainly the 2 million people could not be moved to the West Bank. No. I like the idea of Arab states, of neighboring Arab countries, absorbing some of the Palestinians. I mean, historically, this has always been a central problem. Whereas about 750,000 Palestinian refugees were created in 1948, and a similar number of Jewish refugees from Arab countries in subsequent years, they were all absorbed by Israel especially, and other countries in the world with Jewish populations. The Arab countries have never successfully absorbed. You have large numbers of Palestinian refugees, for example, in Lebanon, but they're not properly integrated into Lebanese society.
Ronnie, grateful to you. Very, very important contribution. Thank you so much. I mean, I think that we've got to think about the other wider political effects here within Israel itself. And the wider political effects is to enable and encourage the far-right forces within the Netanyahu cabinet, for whom actually, believe it or not, Netanyahu is something of a break at times, to think we can get everything we want here. We've got an American president. We have a unique opportunity of an American president who is not only instinctively on our side, which actually most American presidents are in one form or another, but who has actually advocated one of the most extreme positions that we've had within Israel itself, which is the creation of a greater Israel and the forced relocation of many of the Palestinians who live within. And I think that in terms of what this does is basically make any negotiated settlement that would be acceptable to the Palestinians all but impossible. All but impossible. Because why would they, when those forces within Israel think that they have within their grasp, those most extreme forces, when they think they have what is in their grasp, what they've always wanted, why would they compromise with anybody? That's what I mean when I say that Trump is altering the calculus of politics as it exists right now, today, in Israel, in the Middle East. Never mind this fantasy about the Riviera. Let's talk to Abdi, who's in Watford. Abdi.
Hi, Lewis. How you doing?
Morning. Yeah, well, thank you. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so basically, I seriously don't understand Donald Trump's thinking here, because when you think about, number one, he plays into the hands of Hamas. Okay, so now suddenly they become a freedom fighters, and obviously they can tell, look, this is what we've been telling you. We're going to be, exterminated from our land. Okay, ethnic cleansing and all sorts, and we've been killed. So therefore, they've become that is something that gives them a limelight. Mm-hmm. Number two, the people who live in Gaza, why would they leave their homes? Would you like to be relocated somewhere in France and leave the UK? Mm-hmm. Would he go to Mexico and relocate to Mexico?
Well, I certainly don't think he's offering to take these people into the United States. I don't think that's on the cards.
Exactly. Why doesn't he take all these settlers, Jewish settlers, back to and give them a house in Florida where he lives? It's just ridiculous. Everybody's been working hard trying to get a two-state solution. And if you look at the land from 1948 till today, if we look at historically, that land for Palestinians is getting smaller and smaller and smaller because of the settlement. Yep. Okay, and now he's giving them, he's giving the Israeli far right, like you said before, exactly what they wanted. And the Israeli prime minister, he's a far right himself. He obviously plays cool and tells the world what they want to hear, but in the background, he agrees with these far rights. He wants to get rid of Palestinians. And I can tell you this now, it's going to happen because Donald Trump has given away east of Jerusalem to the Israelis and took away from the Palestinians. He absolutely has no respect for the Palestinians. He has he doesn't want to give them anything.
I think more than anything, Abdi, I think what Trump is, and I think Trump is just largely completely ignorant of the history, right? I mean, he's pretty ignorant of and I really don't mean this in an insulting way. Maybe it sounds insulting, but I think it's just objectively true. Trump is very ignorant about the history of the United States. You know, he's shown that many, many times. I think he's comprehensively more ignorant about the history of the West of the world, including the Middle East. So I think I wonder whether there's two ways of interpreting this, isn't there? One is a more malign view, which is it's all part of a kind of plan which is being hatched by Netanyahu and others, and then Trump is a useful sort of tool within it, which is to have the kind of greater Israel. That's one view, and maybe they're not mutually exclusive, these. Another one is simply that Trump is, he just is so ignorant of the actual history and the actual situation and the actual politics of the situation, and he doesn't care to learn it, that he simply sees all of these people living there, sees the destruction, just thinks, well, this is stupid, and just thinks of it like a real estate developer thinking, well, if we just get rid of these people, we'll just build some hotels, it'll be much better.
Absolutely. I think he sees views the world, and I don't think he's going to go and do the same thing, probably go to Ukraine and say, part of your land, you need to give it to Russia for me to give the world a peace. And that's exactly what he's going to do. And for the Palestinians, this is not acceptable. It will never be acceptable. They will never leave their home. They would rather live in a little hut somewhere in Gaza to leave them. And why should they? Why would they leave?
Well,
their home?
that's the thing that he doesn't understand, right? And again, this is about the ignorance. He's not aware of the long history and the attachment. He just sees it. He looks at Gaza and he thinks, well, why would anyone live there? I wouldn't want to live there. But he doesn't understand that for Gazans, this is their home, and they are. If anyone's ever interviewed any Palestinians, any Gazans, they know how emotionally attached they are. Despite it all, despite how horrendous it is in so many ways, they're very attached to their homeland.
I can tell you, Louis, every single day, the 750,000 refugees in the Middle East, they come back to Palestine, and some of them want to come back to Palestine, and some of them are saying we want to go back to our homes, and they've never been allowed. And Palestinians have learned this from history. They will never leave their home. You either have to kill them, all of them, 2 million people, and the people in the West Bank, which every day are facing difficulties because their land has been confiscated. It's just ridiculous. And the world needs to do something for these poor Palestinians.
Abdi, grateful to you. Really, really. I mean, I think you put your finger on it exactly there, which is the thing that, and again, and I'm sure for lots of people listening, and maybe for everybody who is not familiar with the region, it seems sort of incomprehensible just how attached people might be to a place where it is so difficult to live. Very often, of course, many are not allowed to leave by the Israelis, but nonetheless, you have to understand the deep, deep sentiment and deep attachment and the deep history that Palestinians have for this place and how interwoven it is, going back to, as I say, the Nakba, how much they often feel that they are the victims, rightly, of countries and great powers with grand designs over which they have no control. The only control they have is whether they decide to leave or to go, and many want to stay. They don't want to leave or to go, they want to stay. And this plan obviously flies in the face of all of that. We're going to continue this conversation, think a little bit about the British politics and the British political implications a bit later in the show. Want your thoughts continuing. 0345 6060973 0345 6060973. First though, at 10:31, let's get the LBC News headlines with Thomas Watts.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 10:34. Let's get a few of your texts on this. Chris in Leeds says, Lewis, this was always going to happen if Trump got elected. He would get to work with Netanyahu, get rid of the Palestinians from Gaza, undoubtedly the West Bank in the future, but phrase it in a way that makes him a good guy and it's best for the Palestinians. And then Israel would finally get what they've wanted for decades, the entirety of the land and rid of the people they've oppressed, trying to stop them. It's hideous. Its ethnic cleansing must not go ahead. Henry says it sounds horrific, but it's essentially a two-state solution with Trump apartments, Trump hotels and a McDonald's. I mean, I do think that Trump's psyche and background as a real estate developer is absolutely central to all of this. Let's talk to Chris Guinness, who's a former chief spokesperson for UNRWA, which of course has been the primary UN mechanism of delivering humanitarian food supplies to Gaza. Chris, thanks so much for joining us this morning. This has obviously upended decades of US foreign policy assumption. What impact do you think it will have in the region, and in particular potentially on the very delicate ceasefire, which is of course only just holding?
Lewis, before I answer that, can I just say very quickly, I've been phoned up many times this morning by friends and people in Gaza who are distraught, and they say, we will go back to our homes, particularly even in the north, which are frankly craters where they and their children are reliant on food kitchens, where they face mass starvation, disease and death. They'd rather do that than face homelessness on the streets of Cairo, in Egypt, in Jordan. So let's make that very clear. I think we have to see this in terms of the context. Now, Raphael Lemkin, who coined the word genocide, was very clear that genocide is a continuum. And from the Palestinian perspective, that began arguably in 1948 with the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians from their lands. The next layer of context, I think, in which we need to see this Trump announcement is 1967 and the occupation of Palestinian land. The next layer is 2007 and the imposition of the blockade on Gaza. And of course, we saw Hamas rising up against these layers of context, if you like, an attack which, of course, was a terrorist attack, which the world has rightly condemned. But that is the context. In terms of the implication, I think that the basis of peace in the Middle East has been resolutions 242 and 338, in which we find the concept of land for peace. And this is the concept, by the way, which underpins international law. It's the piece of law that says to Putin, you cannot simply acquire large chunks of Ukraine by force. It's the piece of law that says to China, you can't just take over, parts of Taiwan or Taiwan by force. So if we throw that away, if we go with this Trump plan, then we're throwing away the international rule of law. You're saying to NATO countries, well, if Russia invades you, that's part of the new order. So it's disastrous in terms of the international order. And closer to home for Israelis and Palestinians, I think it throws into serious jeopardy phase 2 of the peace plan. If this peace plan results in 2.3 million Palestinians being forcibly ejected from Gaza and their homes being developed by Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff, his Middle East envoy, who, of course, as one of your listeners has rightly noted, are both New York property developers. If that's where this peace plan is going, then of course no one is going to move into phase 2. So it brings into doubt, I think, very seriously, whether the hostages, whether the Israelis will be released, and of course the Palestinians.
You think that there's a possibility that Hamas respond to this by saying, we're not going to continue with the next stage because where will it go? Where will it get us? It will just get us to a position where Palestinians are forcibly removed from their homes.
I think some in Hamas will definitely be saying that. They'll be saying, well, what is the point? And by the way, if this is the opening salvo of Trump's deal of the century, this was going to be the big deal for peace between Israel and the Palestinians, then, okay, it's a very daring opening gambit. It's very Trumpian. But frankly, I think if you ask, the Saudis, for example, who are going to be key to this deal of the century, what they think of this, one would hope that at least privately they would reject this because... Sorry, you speak.
Sorry, I was going to say, Chris, do you think we should take this seriously? And then as a sort of secondary question to that, do you think that people in the region, and in particular Palestinians, will take it seriously?
I mean, there's one level at which it has to be taken seriously because this is the American president and this is Benjamin Netanyahu, the main ally of America in the Middle East. But I mean, having said, yes, we have to take it seriously in terms of face value, I think we have to look beyond what it looks like at face value and unpack what's actually going on. And I think what is actually going on is this is part of Trump's smashing the whole architecture up, whether it's, the American economic model, whether it's foreign relations, whether it's peace in the Middle East. That's what he is doing, and he's going to try and rebuild it. So in that, to that extent, I think we have to take it seriously. And I think Israelis and Palestinians have no choice but to take it seriously. But I think at the end of the day, if you're Palestinian, you think, well, there's 4 years of Trump, and one assumes that after 4 years, let's pray that there's some kind of normality that returns to international relations. And if you're Hamas, they are millennials. For them, Gaza will be there in 1,000 years' time. Who knows what the White House or Israel will look like in 1,000 years' time? That's their mindset. So, we need to think about how they are absorbing this news today, because they are the people who really matter in this.
It is clear, isn't it, in terms of, if we let's take it on face value, as you say, central to this would be Trump saying that neighbouring countries, including Jordan and Egypt and others, would take those Palestinians forcibly displaced from Gaza. Now, that is not something, obviously, those countries have been willing to do hitherto. It is certainly not during the Gaza war, at least. And that is something they've rejected today. That's just not on the table, is it?
No, and let's not forget that Jordan already has 2 million Palestinians living there, and they have destabilized that country in the past, or so many Jordanians would phrase it, and that is a real concern for Jordan. And it's not just an issue you can throw billions at. You can't just throw billions at Jordan and say, use this to deal with the Palestinians, build them homes, accommodate them. It's much more complex than that. And those complexities, I think, in terms of the situation within Jordan are not grasped by President Trump. And I think the same is true of Egypt. I think, the Muslim Brotherhood is widely seen as being that organization which spawned Hamas. And I think that many in Egypt see this not just as an issue of foreign relations. They see it as a matter of internal security. And what the last thing that Egyptian security needs is an angry, displaced population coming over from Gaza. And some would say that the Egyptian government would fall if this were to happen. So it's potentially hugely destabilizing. And I really think it would be interesting for you to find out, talking to Jordanian officials and Egyptian officials, how much preparation, how much talk went on between Cairo and Washington and Amman, the Jordanian capital, and Washington before this announcement was made, because I would suggest that very little forward planning was done. And I think that although we've heard these ideas floated before, Trump has said before he wants Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, who's a big businessman, to come in and develop beachfront property in Gaza. Of course, the Israeli settler movement are licking their lips too, because they'd join in. But I wonder to the extent to which there's been any form of consultation with America's so-called allies in the Middle East.
If they were, again, let's take it at face value, Trump is suggesting that America would own the Gaza Strip. That would imply American soldiers being deployed. To be absolutely clear, this would be happening on the basis of what authority? It certainly wouldn't be happening on the basis of the United Nations.
Yeah, it is completely unlawful. There is no basis in international law which would allow any of this to happen. The expulsion of an entire people from their lands, American property developers going in. It's just beyond international law. And I don't think any serious lawyer either in Washington or in any government department anywhere in the world is going to take this at all seriously. As I say, this would be to throw away the international rule of law and to open the floodgates for any Putin-type dictator simply to march into any land they desire and just take it over. So I really think that if this does move much further, we're going to see attempts to throw Israel out of the United Nations General Assembly, just as apartheid South Africa, which of course similarly just ripped up the rule book and wouldn't listen to anyone, just as they were expelled also.
I mean, just finally, Chris, let's leave aside the particulars. Trump is right about one thing, right, which is that he's coming at it and saying the status quo does not work. It has not worked. And that clearly radical thinking is necessary if we are to achieve peace in the Middle East. I mean, he's right about that, isn't he?
He is, but what he's already done, and Ben Gvir and other far-right ministers in Israel are saying, well, let's expel them from the West Bank as well. So, if what you're saying were correct, and we do need to throw away the rule book, and something more moderate and more sane and more rules-based was to come into its place, that would be fine. But what we are already seeing is far-right ministers in Israel saying, great, we've got a green light from Washington to kick the Palestinians, 2.3 million, out of Gaza. Let's kick several million out of the West Bank also, and we'll take that over for Israeli settlement. So, yes, let's throw away the rule book. I can see this, the logic, because nothing has worked very well, but replacing it with something even more radical, even more giving red meat to the Israeli far right, I think that is a recipe for further conflict. It means that Israel is destined not to live in security, in state of security, constantly to be under the threat of terrorist attacks. And it means that Palestinians will not have the dignity and the self-determination that all peoples have according to international law and according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's what we need to come back to.
Chris Guinness there, former chief spokesperson for UNRWA, the humanitarian UN aid organisation which works in Gaza. Want to keep the conversation going. We'll be talking to the Lib Dem leader, Davey, about all of this. How seriously should we take this Trump peace plan? And do we actually think that it has any chance whatsoever that Trump will even try and do it himself? 0345 6060 973 0345 6060 973. Listening to Lewis Goodall sitting in for James O'Brien here on LBC. The time is 10:45.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's coming up to 10:49. Let's get Mark's thoughts, who's in Mill Hill. Morning, Mark.
Good morning, Lewis.
Morning.
I've been listening actually to this programme, to you and to your guest. I have to say I agree more with your first caller than I do with the last two people you had speaking. Sure. And indeed yourself, I'm afraid to say, because I think before we consider why Trump is doing what he is doing, I point out a sincere belief that the basis of how you and many on the left characterise this conflict is entirely mischaracterised. It airbrushes out critical pieces of history and context that will give people a balanced perspective on what's actually going on, really. The first, and let me give you some examples by what I mean by that. So the very first thing is we seem to start always at 1948, then airbrush out anything that was present before it, such as, for example, the idea that Jordanians, Syrians, and quote-unquote Palestinians are all distinct peoples with long histories. Well, in fact, they're not. They're all the same people.
The thing is, Mark, I actually don't, when I'm talking about it and thinking about it, I agree. I think that there is a problem about where you start the history and people argue about that. But in a sense, I'm not sure how germane that is to what we're talking about here, because what we're talking about is a plan that would clearly be illegal, that would have no international authority behind it, and be completely unworkable. So
I disagree, and I'd like to tell you why.
So you can't disagree that it would be illegal. On what legal authority would it be taking place?
Population transfer, which
right, but it's illegal.
At the very beginning of no, it's not.
It is illegal. On what? But excuse me, no, Mark. It's not illegal if both parties consent. But we're not in the early 20th century anymore, when the Turkish and Greek transfer took place. We're not even in a situation of the post-Second World War. We've got international frameworks. We've got the United Nations. On what legal authority would this take place and occur? Tell me.
Well, the original legal authority of a two-state solution, which was, by the way...
That's from the United Nations. That's from the United Nations.
That was from the United Nations. But at the end of the day, look, you can't... It's launching wars are illegal. Now, we've had
No, not necessarily. You can have casus belli. No, because I'm not going to let you say things that are untrue. Not all wars are illegal.
I can't exactly debate with you if you won't let me speak. So are you going to give me the courtesy of having some time to speak to you. Otherwise, I can't really put my point across.
You can,
respectfully.
but Mark, I'm just not going to let you say things that are wrong. So I'm asking you.
Things that are wrong, and I must stop you misinforming your listeners.
Mark, what legal authority? What legal authority would it take? Would it happen under? What aegis? Just answer me that.
For Trump to invade, I'm not certain is the honest answer.
Right,
but do I believe that it's actually necessary for this to happen? Yes, I do. And I want to give you basically to explain why that is. Look, at the end of the day, in 1948, when the League of Nations first and then the United Nations agreed that there needs to be a Jewish homeland, the Arab League collectively, and that was all the countries across the Arab world, which in terms of size, the size of Europe plus European Russia combined, agreed themselves to launch, and in their words, a war of extermination against the Jews, which they duly tried and failed to do in 1948, then tried again in 1967, then tried again in 1973, and then ever since their so-called peace with Israel, in some cases, and in other cases there's been no peace, they have tried to systematically delegitimize Israel for the past 50 years, as evidenced by the fact that United Nations now has more resolutions against Israel than all other countries in the world combined, and that's not a joke. It's so that's the first thing. The second thing,
Mark, I'm sorry, I've cut you off actually because we've got Davey on the line there. I think you've made your point. As I say, I note that you weren't able to say there was any legal authority for this to happen. I hope we can talk about that again. Apologies to you. Let's talk to Sir Ed Davey, though, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, who, of course, will have two questions at Prime Minister's Questions for the Prime Minister. I suspect this might come up, but hey, lucky us on LBC, we've got a preview first. Sir Ed, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Your reaction to the Trump peace plan, so-called?
Sorry, I missed the question.
So you're just asking for your reaction, inviting you to give your reaction to what President Trump has said overnight.
Yeah, it was a very rambling performance by the president, but we've got a fragile truce in Gaza. It's been very difficult to get that ceasefire. We desperately need to hold on to it. And I think ramblings like he was giving are just so risky. And I think they have the effect of a sort of bull in a china shop, when we need really careful diplomacy at this moment. And without that care and diplomacy, the danger of statements like this will not just threaten the ceasefire, but threaten the security of both Palestinians and Israelis. So I think it's a really, really worrying development.
What do you think the British government's response to this ought to be?
Well, I think we need to be clear that we support a two-state solution. A policy, by the way, which has had the support of government after government of all different colours, and as I understand it, it's the position of all the main political parties here, and that we need to make it clear to the White House that remains our position in the UK. He was rambling, so it's very difficult to know quite what the president meant, but if you took him directly at his word, it's very clear that it would breach international law. And that's why I think we need to, with all the different ways of doing that, we need to make that very clear to the White House that we can't support this approach at all.
Do you think we should take what the president has said seriously?
Do you know, it's a very interesting point, Lewis, because he's got a whole set of quite dangerous things if you did take him at his word, whether it's on tariffs, the impact on the world economy, whether it's on Greenland and now on Gaza. And maybe I've missed a few which have been equally bizarre and dangerous. But to be honest, you sort of have to. You can't sort of pretend that he's not said these things. These things matter. He's the most powerful man in the world. He's leader of the United States. And we know the significance of the United States in all matters of trade and defense and security. And so just imagine how these ramblings are being heard around the world. So I think we do have to take him at face value, and therefore we do have to respond to them.
Some people have suggested that if, and let's take it seriously in face value, if the American president was to try and enact this plan, that it would amount to ethnic cleansing. Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, again, it's the ramblings, and trying to unpick exactly what he said is quite tricky.
Well, the forcible relocation of the 2 million Gazans.
From what he said in that very rambling performance, it seems clear that if we enacted that, it would be breaching international law. Clearly, as you know, international courts would need to consider all the different details. That's how it all works. But it's deeply alarming, and it does look like it would be a breach.
But do you think it could be ethnic cleansing?
Well, let's be clear. It's so difficult to understand what President Trump means. So one's got to be careful. It's pretty clear that the total amount of what he said would amount to a breach of international law. That's why the UK government must be clear in rejecting this position, making it clear our support for a two-state solution and upholding international law. That is the reasonable thing for an ally of the United States to say to a friend.
Do you think that, obviously, look, for totally understandable reasons, the Prime Minister, the British government, wants to try and establish a relationship with Trump and the Trump administration? They're going to be there for 4 years. But do you think, given what we've learned about him in the last 2 weeks, and the way that he's handling the presidency in his second term, do you think we can rely on this man at all? Do we think we can rely on him? Can he ever be a reliable security partner?
Well, he's certainly the most unpredictable president of the United States we've ever witnessed, and that creates huge problems given how powerful they are and that they are a close ally. So the Prime Minister has got to work out how he manages this, and I've suggested that on things like trade, for example, and our economy, we need to make sure we have a plan B, given he is so unpredictable. And so I've argued that yes, we should be, looking for some sort of trade deal with the United States, particularly on services. It looks like we could get a deal on services. I think it'd be very difficult more on goods and agriculture, but on services it's possible. However, we also need other plans. That's why I've called for a UK-EU customs union to make it a lot easier for us to trade with our European neighbours. I believe we ought to be talking to Commonwealth allies like Canada, like India and others, to make sure that whatever he does that could potentially harm the world economy, because let's remember, tariffs on China for the United States has an indirect effect on us. Whatever he does, we can grow our economy through trading with other countries.
Just one final thing, Ed, on another matter, still foreign policy, though. There are lots of suggestions at the moment that the British government might end up spending even more money than we previously had thought on the Chagos Islands deal. Do you think it's time that was reviewed, or that the process in that was changed? Because at the moment, all those negotiations should stop, because at the moment it seems there's a concern that we might be paying a very pretty penny to hand over what is British sovereign territory.
I'm really worried about this. I think it's been a shambles. It's been a shambles, by the way, since the whole thing began under the Conservatives. Let's remember Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak were involved in these negotiations, and the current government's taken them forward. And when you try and unpick what's been happening, I've been staggered by the lack of voice of the Chagosians themselves. Let's remember that the Chagosians are a group of people in their own right, separate from Mauritius. So it seems slightly weird that it's the Mauritian government that seems to be calling all the shots. It seems really weird that we've got into this total mess, costing a fortune. So, given it's a shambles, there needs to be reviewed.
Ed Davey there, leader of the Liberal Democrats, giving us his thoughts on what Trump has said overnight. Interesting as well on the suggestion that the Chagos deal, which is definitely becoming more and more politically salient for Keir Starmer, I wouldn't be surprised at all if it came up in PMQs in an hour's time, is going to it should be stopped or should be reviewed. So we might talk about that later on with Natasha Clark, our LBC political editor. We're going to continue the conversation for now, though, about what is going on with Donald Trump and what he's thinking. I think that is the key question, actually. Should we be taking anything that he says seriously? Should people like me be coming on shows like this, having woken up in the morning, seen what Trump says, and say to you whether we should do it or not? Is this something? Is this a unique situation with an American president who, frankly, doesn't even know what he's saying?
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 11:04. Lewis Goodall sitting in for James O'Brien all this week on LBC. Just a reminder, if you're just joining us and just trying to get to grips with the sort of burning hedge maze that is Donald Trump's mind. He said over the last 24 hours, said overnight, that he intends to seize control of Gaza, displace the Palestinian population, and turn the coastal enclave into the Riviera of the Middle East. Benjamin Netanyahu said that praised this and said that this is willingness to think outside the box. But when it comes to Gaza, it's clear that Mr. Trump's thinking is so far outside the box, it's not even clear he knows there is a box. Let's talk to Stephen Flyn now, SNP leader in Westminster, MP, of course, for Aberdeen South. Stephen, Flynn, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Were you shocked by these comments?
Well, Lewis, where do we start? Shocked, angry, frustrated. What we have here is a populist parading as a peacemaker for Palestine. But when you listen to his rhetoric, when you unscramble the details, he's effectively suggesting that the United States of America, the leaders of the free and democratic world, the nation that so many look up to, would be willing to breach the Geneva Convention, would be undertaking actions which are tantamount to ethnic cleansing. And in doing so, he's speaking almost like some sort of colonial power. Now, I think for all of us who believe in international law, who believe in the importance of good, strong relations with our allies, we need to hear now from the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom that he unequivocally condemns this approach, that it's not something that his government could ever possibly countenance agreeing with. And up till now, Lewis, they've not done that. And I've listened to a UK government minister on Radio 4, you'll forgive me, this morning, and they were saying that they won't provide a running commentary on Donald Trump. I'm sorry, you don't get to pick and choose. International law is something which is important. It must be upheld.
So you think we should be? I mean, obviously, what the British government has been doing so far is rather hoping that they always say when you ask them about this. I've done this plenty of times, that we should not look at what he says, we should look at what he does. Do you think we should take him seriously about this plan?
Yes, absolutely, we should, and we should do that just as we should have done when Donald Trump was threatening our allies in Denmark in relation to Greenland, when he was threatening our allies in Canada with absurd tariffs. We need to find unity with our allies against what the president is calling for. And Lewis, what makes this all the more absurd is that he's talking about the fact that Gaza has been decimated while sitting in front of a 2-bar fire with the man who decimated the place in the first place, the man for whom there's an arrest warrant out from the International Criminal Court, a man who, should his feet touch ground in the UK, should get arrested by the authorities and taken off to The Hague. The absurdity and the dangerous nature of this requires the UK government to find a backbone, to stop being cowardly and hiding away as they've done up till now on these serious matters of international geopolitics, and decide what it is they stand for. And up till now, I've not seen that.
You said just now that this plan would be tantamount to ethnic cleansing. You're confident, you're willing to say that this would be a plan that involves ethnic cleansing if it were enacted?
I mean, anyone who sits on your show and says otherwise isn't listening to what the President of the United States is saying. He's been very clear with regards to wanting to clear out Gaza, to turn it into some sort of metropolis on the sea, or Riviera on the sea, as I think he put it. He thinks that another nation is, a bit of real estate in New Jersey. It's utterly absurd, it's dangerous, it's damaging. And I think for those of us in politics who want to stand up to populists, we have to be willing to take them head on. We have to be using language that they understand, and we have to do that quickly and abruptly. And it's all good and well for me to do that, but what we need to hear this from is the UK Prime Minister and our allies across Europe and indeed across other parts of the world who condemn this sort of action. If this was Vladimir Putin, if this was Xi Jinping, we'd be outraged. There'd be statements in the House of Commons, there'd be politicians firing off at all angles. Well, if we have a special relationship with the United States, let's put it to good use. Let's be clear about what it is that we believe in, and let's hold the president to account.
Isn't it true, Stephen Flynn, that whatever you think about the particulars of what Trump has said and how credible they are as any kind of solution to the Middle East conflict, it is certainly true that his initial frame of analysis, which is what he came out with last night, by saying that American foreign policy, general policy towards to the situation in the Middle East has not worked and will continue not to work, and therefore something innovative should be done, whether you think it's this or something else.
Well, I think it's stating the blindingly obvious to suggest that the Western world's approach to the Middle East hasn't perhaps been as successful as we all might have hoped. We don't need to look that far back in the UK Parliament's own history with regards to the Iraq War and so on and so forth. In that context, or the withdrawal from Afghanistan, leaving the women of Afghanistan at the mercy of a brutal Taliban regime. So no, we've not been successful in dealing with the Middle East, but the response to that is not to act like you are the president of the world and that you can simply do whatever you say and want when it comes to the sovereign territory of another people, all the while sitting doing that next to the man who's just caused extreme destruction and devastation on that area itself. As I said earlier, Lewis, if you're going to have a special relationship, if you're going to be a NATO partner, if you're going to be a UN Security Council member, you've got to decide what it is you stand for. And in a world which is toxic and dangerous, where populism is thriving, you don't bend the knee to it, you take it on. And that requires the Prime Minister to be clear about what his views are here.
Do you think the Prime Minister and the government are being cowardly towards Trump at the moment?
Yes, I do. In the same way that they were cowardly at the start of all of this. And look, Lewis, let's not forget here, there are still hostages held by Hamas. The president, in my view, has put those hostages in a grave situation because Hamas are not going to respond to this with any sort of kindness, are they? And we need those hostages out. They should be returned to their families. It's absurd, the situation that we've found ourselves in. And, when we go back to the response that Israel had to the devastating attack on October the 7th, I was one of the first folk who came out in the House of Commons and said there should be a ceasefire. I remember the now Prime Minister at that time saying that they had a right to defend themselves, that cutting off food supplies and water and all that was acceptable, it was not a problem. They found every way possible to not call out what was happening in Gaza. He chose to be cowardly then. He cannot choose to be cowardly now that he holds that office.
Of course, we see how turbulent the world is. We can see that the United States is no longer necessarily a reliable security partner for us and Britain. What part of breaking up the United Kingdom into a smaller part do you think would make us more powerful in resisting that?
I think what would help Scotland in that context is being part of a European bloc which is able to work together. Now, of course, the UK finds itself in an invidious position where it is not in a good relationship with its friends and allies on the European continent. Now it has an American president who is shooting off. Do
you think Europe would welcome the breakup of the UK in the current circumstances?
I think Europe would be more than welcoming of a productive nation like Scotland joining its alliance in order to push forward the values that we all hold dear. And of course, we could get into a wider conversation about the benefits that Scotland could provide to the European Union, just as the European Union could provide those benefits to Scotland. But that's a much wider conversation, and I'm sure you've got time for, Lewis, as much as I would like to have it.
Well, I'm sure. One final thing. Do you think that there is a conversation going on at the moment, again, alluding to that point about how reliable the US currently is in terms of being a security partner? You'll be aware of the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard to be the US National Intelligence Director, someone who has had, let's say, associations and had positive things to say about, among others, President Assad, President Putin. There is an ongoing conversation about whether Britain can continue to provide and share intelligence secrets with the United States if she ascends to that office. Do you think that's a concern?
Well, look, the Five Eyes network that we operate in partnership with our allies across the world is hugely important. It allows us to ensure the safety of the people who we represent on these isles and to share information with our allies across the world to ensure that their citizens are safe as well. I think that's something that needs to be cherished and protected. But you don't protect those things, you can't cherish those things if you're not willing to speak truth to your allies. And we need to be clear with the United States of America what it is that our values are, what it is that we believe in, and make sure that that is the starting point for the discussions that we have as we continue to work with them and others to protect the people we represent.
Stephen Flyn there, SNP leader in Westminster, MP for Aberdeen South, saying that the government is acting in a cowardly way with regards to Trump. It will doubtless be at the very top of the agenda of Prime Minister's Questions, which of course we will take live on this show from 12 noon and have full analysis before and after as well. I want to continue the conversation with you. We've heard from two very leading, very senior Westminster politicians about their views of two varying degrees of intensity with regards to what Trump has had to say. I want to talk to you about what you think. 0345 60 60973. Should we be taking Donald Trump seriously with regards to this plan? And if we are to take it seriously, on the what basis? What legal basis? I go back to that question I was asking Mark. What legal basis can it happen under? Because there is no international basis, as far as I can see, under international law for it to happen. 0345 60 60973. Listening to Lewis Goodall here on LBC, sitting in for James O'Brien all week. The time is 11:15.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 11:17. When I was saying before about Trump becoming more expansionist, I think you have to see all of this through that lens. I mean, just consider the first couple of weeks. And again, remember that Trump ran as the anti-war candidate back in 2016, when the memories of Iraq were a little fresher, perhaps, than they are now. Just consider the first 2 weeks. Basically, absolutely in the traditions of 19th century imperialism. First, there was the move to try and buy or indeed annex Greenland. Then annexing Canada, referring to the Prime Minister there, Justin Trudeau, as Governor Trudeau, reclaiming the Panama Canal, which the US abandoned sovereignty over, renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, and now envisioning taking over perhaps the worst conflict zone in the world and making it part of the United States, or at least governed by the United States. I mean, never mind the fact that he could not name a single legal authority that would give him sort of access to do that or permit the United States to unilaterally assert control over that territory. 2 million people, relocating 2 million Palestinians. Imagine the cost, imagine the logistical challenge, imagine the political effects that will have on the equilibrium of the Middle East. And never mind the fact that it would require huge commitments of US troops, which there would not be bandwidth for within American politics right now. So the very fact that despite all that, he's come out and said this is remarkable. And I think, as I say, either speaks to a Trump who is not fully aware of what he's saying, or speaks to a Trump who is part, perhaps, of a slightly wider design, or part of something that else is going on. Let's talk to Naz, who's in Enfield. Naz.
Yes. Hi, Lewis. I've been discussing this problem with James for a long time, for years. And now President Trump is acting, as you said, he's the president of the whole world. So he can just pick a place and say, right, I'm going to get rid of all the people and make it into a Riviera. Watching those poor people marching to a land which has been decimated by Benjamin Netanyahu and his armies and his government, and these poor people are walking, as you've seen, walking to where their homes were. And then to tell them, oh, sorry, you have to move to Jordan or you'll have to move to Egypt, without getting those the consent of those countries, is showing President Trump, to the world that the world has to stand up to President Trump, because he doesn't recognize the International Criminal Court, nor does Benjamin Netanyahu. For him to welcome Benjamin Netanyahu as the first person to be invited to the United States, yes, and to sit next to him and smile, grinning like a Cheshire cat, he's won the cream. He's got that,
Well, I think that the problem is, in terms of just keeping the peace settlement going as it is that this is, as I've been saying, I think one of the net results of this is to embolden, whether we take the plan seriously or not, it has real effects because he is the US president. And it is going to be to embolden the very, very, very radical elements, many would say far-right elements of the Israeli government, to try and get what they want, their maximalist approach, which is to basically have a greater Israel. And why wouldn't they? Because they've got an American president apparently telling them that he'll do it for them.
Why wouldn't they? And I just hope the world stands up this time, because they've been the people of the world haven't been slow, but the governments have been very slow, including ours. Keep on justifying Israel has to defend itself. This has gone far enough now. It's defended itself. It's killed so many people. And now it's got a Riviera planned with the president. And the president has to... unfortunately, what I was going to say is in the Geneva... In the UN, so if America abstain in anything or don't vote for it, nothing gets passed with the Big Five. So I really think that today Keir Starmer has to pin his colours on, what he's going to say to the president, what he's going to do, because a lot of people have put trust in him, saying that he wanted Keir Starmer, that is, two-state solution. He's going to support it, but things are looking, very grey at the moment until the whole, sort of humanity stand up for the Palestinians. There is going to be, I've studied World War II, there's going to be ethnic cleansing. This is ethnic cleansing, no matter how you want to describe it. And I know you might disagree with me on that, but, lifting out nearly 2 million people and forced displacement.
Yeah.
What else can you say?
Well, Naz, grateful to you, Naz in Enfield there. I mean, in a sense, it doesn't really matter what I have to say about that matter, about it being ethnic cleansing. I think that the very least you can say is that there's a very credible claim that it would be. Let's take Senator Chris Van Hollen, who's on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the Senate in the United States, who says that what Trump was proposing, he's a Democrat, of course, but what Trump was proposing was ethnic cleansing by another name. Hale Soifer, Chief Executive of the Jewish Democratic Council of America, said overnight the notion that the United States is going to take over Gaza, including with the deployment of US troops, isn't just extreme, it's completely detached from reality. In what world is this happening? Khaled El-Gindi, visiting scholar at Georgetown University Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, an expert in these matters, said Trump's comments were truly bizarre and incoherent. Is he talking in geopolitical terms, or does he just see Gaza as a massive beachfront development project? And for whose benefit, he says? Certainly not Palestinians who are to be relocated en masse. Will the US be the new occupier of Gaza, replacing the Israelis? What US interest could that possibly serve? Let's talk to Vic, who is in Heathcote. Vic.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
I think there is a bit of an elephant in the room here. Can you imagine if Mr. Biden had said that? Everybody would have said, hold on a sec, he's in cognitive decline, no good, no, this is, he's on his way out, etc., etc. I think Trump is done. I honestly think he's done.
Well, he's got another 3 years and 11 months to go, so it's going to be quite the spectacle if that's so.
Well, I mean, yes, theoretically he has, yes. Do you think if they've got the backbone to do it, would they enforce the 25th Amendment?
No, I don't think they would, no.
Unless
it was so obvious. Just to explain to people, the 25th Amendment is basically the constitutional mechanism by which you would remove a president if they're incapacitated or unable to do the job. I think if we've learned one thing, Vic, over the last not just 4 but 8 years longer, is that the US Republican Party, when it comes to Donald Trump, is a body in search of a spine. And I don't think that there would be, unless he was so incapacitated, unless he was so obviously, self-evidently incapable of doing the job, then I don't think there's any way it's ever going to get invoked.
I also think that this is I've heard the saying, WMD, it's a weapon of mass distraction.
Yes.
Because
flooding the zone, as Steve Bannon has called it, flooding the zone. You basically put so much stuff out there that the media doesn't know what to focus on, and then we get distracted from the real stuff.
Exactly. And I think he's doing so much damage internally to the US. This Elon Musk stuff's going on and all that sort of thing. I think he's doing so much damage internally. He has to have something else to this is a proper distraction. I mean, he's caused such a furore with this Israel thing.
Thing is, though, Vic, is that I would agree with you that we have to be very careful. It's something we've had to try and immediately learn, is to kind of, you don't respond to absolutely everything he says, because otherwise you lose track of where the real story is. And I agree with that, and I've been doing my best in the first couple of weeks, Trump presidency, to try and sort of live by that maxim. Problem is with something like this is that even if he doesn't mean it, and even if he's just trying to flood the zone, and even if he just forgets about it within 24 hours, with something like this, there are real-world effects because it does alter the calculus of the Middle East, and he is taken seriously by the players in the Middle East. So already there's doubtless going to be some effect on the ceasefire plan as it currently holds. So it's almost impossible to ignore.
Well, yes, absolutely, but I just sort of, you kind of hit your head against the brick wall. You said, really? Has he said this now?
Yes.
I mean,
We're 2 weeks in.
Well, it's going to be a very interesting 4 years.
Yeah, Vic in Heathcote, grateful to you. Lee is in Newport. Lee.
Hiya there,
Morning.
Lewis. How are you?
Yeah, well, thank you. Your thoughts on this latest escapade?
I don't think it's a weapon of mass destruction. Why? It's because Benjamin Netanyahu is at the wheel and he's a Zionist. Also, as well, I do believe Trump in what he's saying as well, okay? I do believe him because, A, he's got Miriam Mandelson behind him, give $100 million to his campaign. Also, Jared Kushner's very friendly with Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu used to go around and sleep in actually Jared Kushner's bed in like half term and so on and so forth like that. Also, he's got Mike Huckabee Sanders there as well, who's the ambassador of Israel, who said the other day and recorded there are no Palestinians. I personally don't believe that Trump knows the history of this. If he did, he wouldn't be going to King Abdullah and telling him to let Palestinians in because his grandfather got assassinated by a Palestinian nationalist because of what happened on the West Bank.
But do you think we should take him seriously, Lee, is the question. Do you think we should take him seriously?
100%. Also, as well, like the thing, what I think will happen, this is what I think will happen, right? I think, like Ilan Pappé said, this is the beginning and the end of Zionism. Now, what I believe will happen, America will take over. They won't be going to Jordan. They won't be going to Egypt. They should be let back into Israel. The right of return. That's what should happen, realistically. But that will not happen, because what will happen, America will have to put troops on the ground.
Well, yes.
And then Trump's MAGA base comes into play then, which is America first. And they don't believe that troops should be in there.
No, but the MAGA base will follow him. But the MAGA base will follow him, Lee, at least for a while, if he was serious about it. I think over the American public wouldn't. That's certainly for sure. And I think there will be huge reluctance within the establishment of the Republican Party. But honestly, I've spent enough time with these people. If he says jump, they say how high.
Okay, Lewis, let me put something to you like this then, right? So when they had all that Flyn and they had the 100 tornadoes and had the 100 million that the FEMA did, their MAGA base weren't happy with that because $24 billion just went to Israel, didn't it?
Yeah, that's true. He does, there is an interesting relationship between the two. Lee in Newport, grateful to you. Luke says, you're losing your mind over Trump comments, Lewis, but what has he said that's bad? He wants the best for the Palestinian people. Listen to his comments. He wants the Riviera of the Middle East, fresh, beautiful piece of land, make it enjoyable, responsible for all the unexploded bombs, create jobs and housing. So why are you spinning this suggest other than positive? Don't forget, Hamas created this mess. Well, Hamas certainly started the war. There's no two ways about that, Luke. Of course, you can choose your sort of start date in terms of the wider context, but for sure. But quite frankly, Riviera, Middle East, fresh, beautiful piece of land, make it enjoyable, responsible for all the unexploded bombs, create jobs and housing. I want whatever you're smoking, mate. I really do. I really, really do. Yeah, I mean, it's like saying, oh, I'd love to put a golf course on the moon. What's wrong with that? Yeah, but it's not going to happen, is it? So we're just going to debate and we can say, oh, that makes him a great person because he wants to make it into the Riviera of the Middle East. At what cost? By moving all the people out there. Definitely wouldn't be a Riviera for them, would it? No way. But just for American property developers instead. Meanwhile, where are all the Palestinians? Still homeless, just outside their own home. Sounds like a great plan. We're going to continue this conversation over the course of the next half hour before the run-up to PMQs, which will, of course, take live on the show. As always, where doubtless this will be a big subject. If you've got thoughts on it, 0345 6060 973. Should we be taking Donald Trump seriously? But at 11:30, almost on the dot, you don't get that with James O'Brien, do you? Let's get the very latest LBC news with Thomas Watts.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 11:33. A few of your texts. We're going to get the view from Washington in a second. A few of your texts first, though. Claire says, hello, Lewis. Great show. I really think the lives of the remaining Israeli hostages are seriously at risk now. Trump has put his cards on the table. It's disgusting. If the world lets this happen, shame on us all. Darren says, hi, Lewis. American foreign policy disasters such as Iraq and Afghanistan. We'll see even more displaced people make their way to Europe. Millions of Palestinian refugees will need homes. Do Americans care? Absolutely not. They're not the ones picking up the pieces. Starmer must not throw us under Trump's bus. Well, it'll be very, very interesting to see how the Prime Minister calibrates his words. Doubtless that will have been the subject of much discussion in 10 Downing Street over the course of the morning, trying to get every single word exactly calibrated to ensure that he says enough that it looks like he doesn't agree with it, whilst not really looking like he doesn't agree with it. Let's talk to Simon Marks, LBC's Washington correspondent, and get the view from DC, which has, of course, had these comments overnight and doubtless will be waking up this morning, internalising it. We are playing, aren't we, Simon, once again, the game of what has he said now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, Lewis, that once again, as it was throughout the first term of Donald Trump's presidency, I think that's partly deliberate, because we're not this morning here now talking about the fact that 10,000 employees of USAID, the Agency for International Development, have basically been told it's all over, we're wrapping up, you're coming home wherever you are in far-flung parts of the world. Instead, we are talking about this absolutely astonishing gambit by Donald Trump. I mean, the way the day played out yesterday, and indeed the way multiple days have played out, now you can see where everything was leading. You can now this morning play a game of join the dots. About 10 days ago at the White House, apropos of nothing in particular, he started talking about North Korea and talked about what he referred to as North Korea's unparalleled condo capability, building condominiums, because he said they had so much great oceanfront property. And at the time I thought, that's interesting. I wonder if vaguely he's applying the same logic to Gaza. Then yesterday, before that press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu, we saw him multiple times. I mean, one of the things about this president is accessibility. Yes. Unlike Joe Biden, we see him all the time, every single day, multiple times, which on the one hand is a reporter's dream, until, of course, it then all becomes everyone's nightmare. So earlier in the day, he had talked about this notion of depopulating Gaza, forcing or inviting Jordan and Egypt to take Gaza's 2 million people because you couldn't possibly live in Gaza. It's a demolition site. I mean, no concession whatsoever given to the fact that the Palestinians in Gaza consider it their home, that it's sovereign territory. How on earth are you actually going to physically force them to leave Gaza? And he kept talking about all of these beautiful new locations that could be built to house the Palestinians. Several days ago, he talked about cleaning it out in reference to Gaza. And then last night, in the middle of that press conference, you could hear a pin drop as in 25 seconds he articulated what his actual vision is for the Strip. Just let's take a listen to this. This is how it was first introduced and detailed at that press conference last night.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area.
You could have heard a pin drop in the East Room of the White House last night as reporters all realized the magnitude of what he was saying. You could have heard the screech of tires outside the building as people said, what on earth is he now suggesting? And it became apparent that the president, who of course prides himself on his background as a real estate developer, prides himself on being a construction magnate, absolutely is viewing all of this through exactly the same prism as you would view any kind of business development when you'd suddenly discovered a new bit of undeveloped land looking out on the Mediterranean. He actually talked about the United States last night, not just taking it over, but taking a long-term ownership position in Gaza. And there were numerous efforts to try and understand what legal authority he thought he had to do this. What would happen? I mean, at one point, one of the Israeli reporters in the room shouted over him and said, but why would these people leave Gaza? It's their home. And he just completely ignores and sidesteps all of that and says, well, they can't possibly live there. They have no alternative, he says, but to leave. And when he says no alternative, he means, he suggests that they should understand they've got no alternative. But, you know, as with the phrase, clean it out, you can view that phrase of the Palestinians having no alternative as being a much more activist stance by the United States, and he postulated last night the military, in terms of going in there and actually doing the cleaning. And Benjamin Netanyahu, of course, could not believe his ears. I mean, first of all, because the Israeli delegation was surely aware that this was going to raise massive questions about the future of the ceasefire. I mean, what on earth happens now to those remaining Israeli hostages, as one of your listeners has texted in, who are still under the Hamas kosh in Gaza, given that suddenly we're playing 52-card pickup, but also just couldn't believe that here was a president of the United States who appeared to be setting the stage for the depopulation of Gaza and the creation of sort of Dubai on the Med that was going to allow Israel, at the end of it all, essentially de facto to expand its territory.
Simon, the central question, and this is really hard to answer, obviously, because it's impossible to be inside his head. Should we take it seriously?
I think you should definitely take it seriously. I mean, we asked this question again and again and again. Should we take Donald Trump seriously? We asked it about everything that he said in the first term, and then he was constrained by people who were going to take him to one side and say, Mr. President, come on. I mean, let's just step back from the brink. In that room last night, you had Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, now in charge of this steaming issue at USAID that he's suddenly got to resolve unexpectedly. He's now the acting administrator of a US government agency that Donald Trump and Elon Musk have decided, in Elon Musk's words, to feed to the wood chipper. You had the new Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in the room, a man absolutely who is never going to say no to Donald Trump about anything, unlike his predecessors back in the first Trump term. There's no moderating influence on the National Security Council behind the scenes, because all the National Security Council staff were sent home, and Trump and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz are going to be employing their own array of people who, like everyone in this administration, needs to be completely aligned with Donald Trump's principles, his priorities, and his Make America Great Again philosophy. And, Donald Trump is deadly serious when he says that while the Egyptians and the Jordanians are currently saying no to this idea of opening their borders to Palestinians from Gaza, he's pretty sure that eventually they will change their mind. And anyway, he asserted last night, lots of world leaders have already been in touch to say that they'd be more than willing, apparently, to take up to 2 million new residents from Gaza. He indicated last night that this had not been a rapid decision, that he hadn't thought about this on his way into the room and suddenly articulated it. This has definitely been percolating in his mind for a long while, and he views it as a development project. I mean, he views this as an opportunity, and no doubt he views it as an opportunity for the Trump organization and people like his own son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to make vast amounts of money out of all of this. Everything in the national interest is now conflated with what is in Trump's private interest. They tried that in the first term. They were held back from doing it by the checks and balances and constraining influences. This time round, there are no checks and balances. I keep seeing people saying, well, what about the law? I mean, in a whole variety of areas, Elon Musk feeding USAID to the wood chipper is clearly illegal, but they are moving so rapidly and at such a clip that the law and their opponents cannot keep up with them. And this is a major depth charge that obviously he has detonated underneath the entire Middle East process. And like the Abraham Accords, like the possibility of normalized ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia, into which he attempted to breathe new life last night, he thinks that the once unthinkable can eventually become inevitable.
It is quite the contrast, isn't it, Simon, between the first Trump term and the second. The first Trump term, Trump was pretty isolationist. He ran actively against the idea of American entanglement in foreign conflicts, especially the Middle East. And yet this last 2 weeks, he has been profoundly expansionist in his tone. If you think about the different things, he's obviously talked about Greenland, obviously he's been taking on allies and so on economically. And now this is a different Trump we're seeing, isn't it?
Yeah, he wants to be an imperial president. I mean, the inaugural address, where he cited the example of William McKinley, the 25th President of the United States, who governed from 1897 until his assassination in 1901, was not coincidental. William McKinley presided over the territorial expansion of America. He brought Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii, the Philippines. He even attempted to annex Cuba and bring those into America's territorial empire. And Donald Trump wants to do exactly the same. So when he talks about the Panama Canal and Greenland, and he started even Canada being the 51st state, the temptation 3 or 4 months ago, when he first started talking about that while he was still in the transition, was to laugh and to say this is a joke, it's not serious at all. Well, the MOD certainly understands now that this coveting of Greenland is a deadly serious proposal that he is making. And now he's actively talking about placing the stars and stripes on the sands of Gaza. And foreign partners and allies of the United States, obviously including our own government, are going to have to adjust their thinking dramatically, because at a time when President Xi Jinping of China covets the opportunity of bringing Taiwan back into the mainland Chinese aegis, at a time when Vladimir Putin obviously not only covets Ukraine and may well be rewarded with Crimea and a decent slice of eastern Ukraine in any peace negotiations, but he also appears to covet territorial expansion by Russia in the years ahead. Donald Trump is basically saying, I'm the same. I fancy expanding our territory too. And this is an absolutely serious operating principle. He wants to be the William McKinley of the modern era. And he believes that all of these things are in America's national security. Taking over Greenland, we need it, he says. It's a national security imperative. Sticking the stars and stripes on Gaza and its beaches, or even sticking the stars and stripes on Mars, all becomes part of Donald Trump's national security doctrine.
Simon Marks there, LBC Washington correspondent, and giving us his assessment of where this fits into the wider Trump political psyche of the second term. And I think he's absolutely spot on. He's absolutely spot on to see the shift in Trump thinking into a new expansionist, legacy-seeking Trump, a very different Trump, as I've been saying throughout the whole show, indeed earlier in the week as well, to the Trump we saw in Trump first term. This is a different political actor, and as Simon says, British government ministers, Europeans generally have to wake up to it. We're going to be going live to the House of Commons for Prime Minister's questions, where doubtless this question around Gaza is going to come up, and the Prime Minister is going to have an answer to it, one that satisfies those who want to see some sense from the British government that they don't think this is a good idea, whilst trying very delicately to walk that tightrope of not irritating the Trump administration only a fortnight in. We're going live, as I say, to Westminster for that after 12 o'clock. You're listening to Lewis Goodall here on LBC. The time is 11:47.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 11:50, as I say. We'll be going to the House of Commons for Prime Minister's questions just after noon. We're getting the thoughts of our political editor, Natasha Clark. As always, let's talk to Peter first, who's in Oxford. Peter.
Lewis, how are you doing?
Good morning.
First of all, I couldn't agree more with Stephen Flynn and with Simon Marks. I mean, the point Simon made about setting a precedent, I think, is very compelling, because effectively Trump is giving carte blanche for actions in Ukraine and Taiwan to his fellow dictators in those parts of the world. And it's very striking. He didn't mention either of those countries in his inaugural speech. I think that would be heard very clearly by those countries. But the main point I was going to make is the fact that, like Stephen Flynn, I think Starmer needs to come off the fence and speak out, and I think the international community needs to do the same about what's right and what's wrong. Trump's schemes in Gaza are both unrealistic and completely wrong, and that needs to be spelled out. If there's any point in mentioning the word logic, I suspect logic and Trump don't belong together in the same sentence, but there are two very severe logical dissonances in what Trump is saying. First of all, he talks about what a hell Gaza is for the Palestinians, but what a heaven it will be for those who follow them. They can't both be right. It's either it's a heaven or it's a hell, and American money redeveloping it isn't going to change it from one to the other. Not of course that he's prepared to put his hand in his pocket for that purpose, or for rehousing the people who he will make stateless by moving them.
You think we should take him seriously on it, Peter?
Unfortunately, when Starmer says, listen to his actions, not his words, he did, in his first term, deliver on a lot of the most abject and appalling promises that he made. And people said, well, his bark is worse than his bite. I suspect that has been proven wrong. The other illogical difficulty I have about all this is immigration. I mean, from Trump's point of view, for the American people, immigration from other countries and countries in need and countries in crisis, that is the most evil thing that could happen, and the migrants are all, in Trump's view, criminals. Mm-hmm. How can it be different from the perspective of the Egyptians or the Jordanians, who will see a large number of people moving into their country whom they have never asked to come, and who are all severely traumatized by the actions of his friend Netanyahu, and who are going to be, I think, severely militarized by their experience. And why on earth is that kind of immigration welcome, where the immigration to the USA is not welcome?
All right, Peter Knox, are grateful to you. Jim is in Edinburgh. Morning, Jim.
Good morning, Lewis. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Your thoughts on this?
Nice to speak to you.
Nice to speak to you.
I was just thinking, it's a bit ironic what seems to be proposing is a three-state solution, isn't it?
The US being involved.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I mean, it's a bit ironic, US being involved. It's a ludicrous situation, I think. But the thing I'd like to say was straight from the Abrahamic Accord. I don't think the Palestinians got a good deal at all. Certainly, and one of the things I worry about Trump is this: he seems to think of everything as a deal. And what we've got is a situation where he's looking at the whole thing as he is as a land, dealing in land. Your friend Simon stole all my good points, by the way. He was excellent.
Yeah,
but anyway, what I was going to say, one of the things I would amplify, though, was with Jared Kushner. He was supposed to be the man who led the Abraham Accord. Do you know that he got £2 billion of a tip from the Saudi Arabians after it? And
really,
that's why he's been lying quietly with the Trump organisation, because he's been asked about it when he goes on TV and stuff. Nice. Now, he sees himself as a big property man as well. Now, it's this outlook of seeing everything in terms of property developers and making money is extremely, extremely dangerous, I think. And it's a wee bit of an intellectual disaster, I think, for us all, that we can't think in terms of policy, in terms of diplomacy, and we get an intellectual look at the thing. All right. And not a sort of spiv idea,
All right, Jim, grateful to you. Sean is in Heathfield in East Sussex. Sean.
Yeah, I think it's just a bit despicable, really, to be honest, that he's saying that they should leave. I watched a press conference with him and Netanyahu, and you can see Netanyahu smiling like a Cheshire cat, because he's kind of been given what he wanted. I think Trump should just leave off and, let people from Gaza come back and try and rebuild what's been destroyed. Basically, I think he should just back off and leave them alone.
And do you think we should be taking him seriously, Sean?
Yeah, I would. Probably because he's got Netanyahu in his ear, and Netanyahu is, he's got all the American politicians wrapped around his finger. So I think he's kind of using Trump as a kind of middleman. So I think we should take him very seriously. I'm not too sure about the Greenland thing, but I think with Gaza, I think it's, there's a lot of nefarious things going on, and a lot of the settlers post-October 7th were saying they can't wait to go to Gaza and have beachfront properties, and people kind of didn't really take that very seriously. But I think now they are. That's kind of that was their plan. They wanted those properties. So I think, maybe the UN and some other bodies need to step in and kind of tell Trump, just to kind of back off a little bit, I think, and just try and rebuild what hasn't been destroyed. I think most of it's been destroyed. If you look at the pictures and the videos, it's terrible. It looks like something from Mad Max.
Yeah. Sean in Heathfield, grateful to you. I'm just looking at live pictures from the House of Commons now. Obviously, the chamber getting ready for Prime Minister's questions, with Keir Starmer going to face MPs shortly. Joined now by LBC's Natasha Clark, our political editor. Natasha, one way or the other, whether it's Kemi Badenoch or not, he's going to be asked about what he thinks about the Trump peace plan, in inverted commas.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we know that obviously the issue of Israel-Gaza, Keir Starmer's tied himself in more knots than I can count on.
Including
on the
in
issue,
the studio.
Including in LBC's studios before. So I think that might be something that she'll go on, but I'm not quite sure it's a strong enough topic that Kemi Badenoch feels that she will go on the front foot on. So I think it's probably more likely we'll get a backbencher, potentially someone from
Davey.
the SNP, potentially Davey, asking that killer question on what the Prime Minister thinks about this. We've just been hearing from David Lammy in the last sort of hour or so on his thoughts. Obviously, they're trying to do this diplomatic dance of praising Donald Trump for his role in the Middle East, but absolutely distancing themselves from what I think some people in government will consider a completely mad plan to rip up the idea of the two-state solution for the US to steamroller into Gaza to take it over, which, Keir Starmer at some point is going to have to say, this is not something that I support.
It is a great example, isn't it? I mean, just leaving aside, in a sense, what the British government says or otherwise about this is not that germane. We're not a big player in this process. But it's certainly for Keir Starmer. I mean, just thinking about just the course of this week, in terms of a government which is like one of your great abilities or one of your great advantages and assets as the government is the bully pulpit, right? You get to set the terms, you get to set the terms of the agenda, you get to announce what you want to announce when you do it and so on. You get to try and hammer that narrative home. Look at this week. What do they spend every single day talking about? They find themselves in a position where they have to respond to whatever has come out of Trump's mouth in the White House the evening before.
Yeah, totally. And I actually sort of joked with somebody from Number 10 on Sunday, I believe it was, just before I spoke to you. I said, ready for Trump tariff week? And they sort of, laughed it off and said, haha, sure, whatever. But actually, it does feel like they've created a bit of a void this week. And actually, what they should have been doing was getting a bit more on the front foot with some of their policies. And actually, it makes sense for them to do so. A, because the newspapers drop too late to catch any of the Donald Trump stories anyway. So really, that shouldn't really be setting the agenda in that way. But this is their prime opportunity to get ahead on the domestic front. And a lot of people, I think, including some of our listeners, will hear again Donald Trump saying something mad. Something happening in the Middle East. What happens here? What about us? Where is this? The idea of the Prime Minister focusing on these missions, milestones, the plan for change, which every government press release at the moment seems to reference. Going back to the plan for change. This is the Prime Minister trying to get things on straight. Why aren't they really hammering it home to us? It doesn't feel like they're doing it today.
So what do you think Badenoch could go on? I mean, is it possibly, another foreign affairs thing that many people here certainly won't think applies to them, but there is this ongoing rumbling row about the Chagos Islands, isn't there?
I think if I were her, I would go on the Chagos Islands. She has gone on the Chagos Islands before, and we are expecting an urgent question from Nigel Farage, nonetheless, who's going to be asking about the status of that Chagos deal. The Foreign Office this morning have been quite keen to slap down those reports that were in the Times newspaper yesterday about the Chagos deal reportedly costing double what it was going to cost, so going from from 9 billion up to 18 billion. They've completely said that is not going to happen. The Prime Minister of Mauritius clearly is trying to claim a win here. He's obviously come in, he's saying that he's renegotiated this deal. However much of it that we can see has actually been done yet, because they haven't published it. It's not a deal that's actually been done. Donald Trump, of course, as well needs to sign off on this deal. And Downing Street have said that he needs time to look at it. I think he said last week it was not one of the top items on his to-do list. So I think we're still waiting to hear what Donald Trump thinks.
He's got a lot of waterfront property he needs to redevelop in Gaza first. Can see the Prime Minister's got to his feet. We'll go across to the House of Commons as soon as Kemi Badenoch, leader of the opposition, gets to hers. Any other predictions?
I mean, just knowing that Kemi Badenoch likes to throw out random stuff. Will she go out? Will she go on lockdown? Will she go on the Prime Minister's?
Yeah, I was wondering about that. Difficult one for them, surely.
Well, come on. We know exactly what Keir Starmer's going to, respond and just go. Actually, look at this. Your Prime Minister resigned over lockdown breaking rules. Really? Are you really coming at me with that?
Tricky one for the Tories to take the moral high ground on Partygate, I'd say. But hey, as you say, she's
Kemi Badenoch.
She's an unpredictable figure.
Yeah. If I were her, I'd be going on police. I think I'll be going on police funding. We heard the final settlements from the cops last week, and they are really unhappy, lots of them having to make cuts. That would be something which I think would be nice Tory red meat, but also appeal to the man and the woman on the street. And I would be surprised if we get through this Prime Minister's questions without someone mentioning that poll, which shows reform in front. And that, that is a real moment for British politics, isn't it? To see a party that's not the Conservatives or the Labour Party topping a poll for the first time. And look, it's just one poll, but, it's still a big moment.
And we're still waiting, of course, for the news. We've seen Netanyahu in Washington, when it might be that Keir Starmer is on his travels again and going to Washington.
Not this week, I was told. So, that's been the line for the last 3 weeks. So.
At some point, that line will be wrong.
At some point. But look, they wanted to be on the first on the list to go over and visit Donald Trump, and they've been saying that they're holding these phone calls. Donald Trump's been incredibly complimentary of him so far, but still no date in the diary for when Keir Starmer might fly over to Washington for his very first meeting with Donald Trump. So we still await to see that. But again, clearly not first on the priority list. Israel's Netanyahu the first to visit Trump in the White House today. Yesterday.
Chagos is a great example, though, of exactly what we're talking about, which is the extent to which Starmer can end up being buffeted by Trump in any direction he so chooses. Because, of course, if Trump comes out, he's not engaging with it clearly at the moment, but there's every possibility at some point Trump does decide to engage with it. And if he comes out and says, I think this is a terrible idea, it's humiliating for Starmer.
It is, but it also could give him a nice get-out clause, right? And let's be honest,
from his own deal.
Well, a lot of backbenchers are now getting really grumbly about this deal. There's been reports out today of lots of people in government really, really slagging it off. So I could definitely...
Tough one to sell to your constituents. Like, we're handing these islands over, and we're paying for the privilege of doing so.
Yeah.
Now, there may be good reasons for it, but it's a hard one to sell.
It's a really hard sell. And also spending £9 billion at a time where the Treasury is asking every single Whitehall department to make huge cuts. I just
sell
don't
that
think
one down the Dog and Duck in Rotherham.
I just don't think they're going to be able to sell it. And actually, if Donald Trump came back and said, no, I don't want to, if I were the Foreign Office, I'd be taking that one. And I'd just be saying, oh, sorry, Donald Trump said we can't do it, throwing it in the bin, we'll kick it into the long grass, we'll start some renegotiations up later.
I mean, Donald Trump basically has the entire British news cycle and the entire fate for what any particular news cycle of the British government is in his hands at any time, which is exactly what happens to Theresa May, of course. Theresa May would find herself suddenly, he'd given an interview to The Sun or whatever and said, I told her Brexit deal was a waste of time. And you find yourself talking about nothing else for the next sort of 2 or 3 days.
Yeah, exactly. Look, I think the shine will wear off. The Trump missive that we regularly get overnight when we sort of wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and say, oh, what's he said overnight this time? But yes,
do you reckon?
Potentially, yeah. But equally, it will always have...
Right, we're going to go live now to the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, when Labour negotiates, our country loses. Yeah. Yesterday, we heard the government offered £18 billion for Mauritius to take our territory in the Chagos Islands. This is money that belongs to our children and their children. This is an immoral surrender, so North London lawyers can boast at their dinner parties. Mr. Speaker, when Labour negotiates, we all lose. Sometimes they don't even bother. Why did the Energy Secretary withdraw government lawyers from defending the case against the eco-nutters who want to obstruct Rosebank's oil and gas fields?
Mr. Speaker, let me deal with the serious issue she raises in relation to the Chagos case. This is a military base that is vital to our national security and to national security. A number of years ago, the legal certainty of that base was thrown into doubt. And let me, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear, and I'll pick my words carefully. Without legal certainty, the base cannot operate in practical terms as it should. That is bad for our national security, and it's a gift to our adversaries. Now, some within the party opposite know exactly what I'm talking about. That is why, Mr. Speaker, that is why the last government started negotiations about sovereignty and about securing the long-term use of the base. Mr. Speaker, they were right to do so. That's why the last government conducted 11 of the 13 rounds of those negotiations. And, Mr. Speaker, they were right to do so. That is why this government has completed that process, and we were right to do so. Mr. Speaker, I will set out the details when they're finalised, and it will, of course, be presented to Parliament. But if the Leader of the Opposition is properly briefed on the national security implications when she's asking these questions, which she's perfectly entitled to do, then she knows exactly what I'm talking about in terms of national security and legal certainty. If, on the other hand, she's not properly briefed on the national security implications, she's not doing her job, she's not concerned about national security, and she's not fit to be Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, how can anyone believe that this man is defending UK interests when he bends the knee to anyone who asks him? His answer was so weak and so waffly, it is no wonder he needs a voice coach. But he didn't answer the question I asked him, why the Energy Secretary was not defending our country. The Energy and Environment Secretaries received nearly £400,000 worth of donations from Lisbeth Rousing. It's her money behind the court case that will stop an £8 billion investment, threaten thousands of jobs, and endanger energy security for all of us. Did the Energy Secretary refuse to defend UK interests because he's funded by billionaire eco-zealots?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll come to that very issue, but I noticed she didn't say she was briefed about the Chagos issue. This is important. Mr. Speaker, when she became Leader of the Opposition, I said to her that I would give her a briefing on any national security issue if she asked for it. That's very important to the way that we run our democracy. She has not asked for a briefing on the Chagos case. And that's because she's more interested in chasing reform than in national security. In relation to oil and gas, it'll be part of our energy supply for many years to come. We've been absolutely clear about that. But we are going through a transition. It's important because that transition to renewable energy will give us lower bills, energy security, take Putin's foot off our throat, and it's good for the national interest.
Mr. Speaker, this is a weak answer because he doesn't know what is going on. Last week, I asked about the employment bill. He didn't know what was going on. We asked about the education bill. He didn't know what was going on. Let me tell him what is going on. Maybe he can answer some questions. Shell has said a one-year delay to Rosebank will cost £350 million and the loss of 1,000 jobs. Yep. Equinor has said a two-year delay to Jackdaw will cost £800 million. Yep. The only benefit I can see is the £400,000 to Labour ministers. Yep. At a time of war in Europe, threatened energy security, increased competition from the US and elsewhere, we should be getting British oil and gas out of the ground. Does the Prime Minister have the guts to take on Labour donors and his Energy Secretary and approve the licence applications when they are resubmitted?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, she doesn't even want to know what's going on, otherwise she'd have asked for the relevant briefing. She knows the position on Rosebank. She knows the court case that has meant that the licence has got to be reviewed. There's a process that's got to be gone through in the proper way. She understands that, but yet again she's proving all she can do is student politics and playing party politics.
Mr. Speaker, I am speaking on behalf of the people of this country. When Labour negotiates, our country loses. When Labour negotiates, our country loses. He's talking about bringing growth and investment. Last week, he lost a £450 million investment from AstraZeneca that we negotiated, Mr. Speaker, and which would have delivered growth immediately. That same day, he also lost the £8 billion oil field investment that would have delivered next year. Business is abandoning the North Sea because of his decisions. What signal does he think he is sending to investors?
As she knows, AstraZeneca was a commercial decision. She must understand that. But, Mr. Speaker, all she does is come here every week, carping from the sidelines, talking our country down. We've got the highest investment for 19 years. PwC say the second best place to invest in the world. The IMF has upgraded growth. Wages are up. Inflation is down. There's more to do. Reforming planning and regulation. Building new homes. Supporting a runway, the third runway at Heathrow. What unites these? Championed by Labour, opposed by the Tories.
Mr. Speaker, it's so hard to believe anything he says. This is a man who needed emergency voice coaching on Christmas Eve. This government is so clueless. It is borrowing £8 billion. It is so clueless. It is borrowing £8 billion for GB Energy, a vanity project that is not great, not British, and does not produce any energy. Its own chairman, Mr. Speaker, admitted it will take 20 years to create just 1,000 jobs. Meanwhile, 200,000 jobs are at stake in our oil and gas sector right now. Does he think that 1,000 jobs in 20 years' time are worth more than the 200,000 jobs we have now?
Prime Minister. Again, she clearly hasn't been briefed or doesn't want to be briefed. GB Energy, a publicly owned energy company that will drive the move to renewables. That is not about the number of jobs in HQ. It's about the thousands upon thousands of jobs that will generate to give us energy security, something we didn't have under the last government, take Putin's boot off our throat, something we didn't have under the last government. They lost control of the economy. We're getting it back.
He can waffle as long as he likes, Mr. Speaker. But we know that Labour promised to bring energy bills down by £300. Instead, bills are going up. He's freezing pensioners while shoveling money to Mauritius. The Prime Minister isn't just managing decline, Mr. Speaker. He is creating decline. He has the power to grant these licenses, open these oil and gas fields, save British jobs, and bring down bills. Why does he find it so hard to do the right thing?
Right. She really needs to look into how these licenses are granted. Well, I appreciate that their reset seems to be having no policies apart from cutting pensions and having no briefings on relevant issues. Let's just remind ourselves, they presided over the biggest drop in living standards on record. Mortgages went through the roof and they left a £22 billion black hole. And we learned last weekend, Mr. Speaker, that under the last government, £35 billion was lost on benefit fraud and error. Who was at the Treasury at the time, you might ask, Mr. Speaker? The Shadow Business Secretary and the Leader of the Opposition. They want to give lectures. No thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Clacton says that his party is, and I quote, open to anything when it comes to changing our NHS and open to an insurance-based system. So can my right honourable friend confirm that under a Labour government, the NHS will be there for everyone when they need it, not having to worry about the bill?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the NHS is the lifeblood of our country, and that's why we invested £25 billion at the budget, a record amount, and we're making it fit for the future through our plan for change. What a contrast with Reform, whose leader has said that those who can afford to pay should pay for our healthcare. Under Labour, the NHS will always be free at the point of use for anyone who needs it.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister about the terrible murder of the 15-year-old in Sheffield and say that we will support any effective action against knife crime that the government proposes? At his first Prime Minister's questions, I told the Prime Minister about my constituent Andrea. A full-time carer for her mother, Andrea is one of thousands of carers caught up in the carers allowance scandal, hounded by the DWP for repayments. The Prime Minister accepted there was a problem and set up an independent review, and we welcomed that. But 2 months after the announcement of the review, Andrea received a letter summoning her to a tribunal next week. Her mother's health has been deteriorating. She's had to go in a care home. This is the last thing Andrea needs. So will the Prime Minister step in and do the right thing and cancel Andrea's tribunal and all proceedings against carers like Andrea, at least until the review is concluded?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we set up the independent review, and I know he welcomes that and was the right thing to do. I don't know the details of Andrea's case, but I will certainly, if he provides them to me, make sure that we have the details and look into what's happened in her particular case.
Sir Ed Davey.
I'm grateful for that reply. The Secretary of State for DWP wrote to me and wasn't interested in engaging, so I hope the Prime Minister will. Mr. Speaker, turning to foreign policy now. Last night, many of us were alarmed to hear President Trump speak about forcibly displacing 1.8 million people from Gaza. The Prime Minister has spoken to the President on several occasions now. Does he personally believe that Trump recognises the dangers of statements like this to the fragile ceasefire in Gaza, and indeed to the security of both Palestinians and Israelis? I'm glad that the Foreign Secretary has confirmed that the government's position is still a two-state solution. I think that has support on all sides of the House. But will he reassure the House that this position and our concerns on these dangerous statements from the President will be communicated to the White House directly and firmly?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you raised a very important issue. The most important issue on the ceasefire is obviously it's sustained. We see it through the phases, and that means that the remaining hostages come out and the aid that's desperately needed gets into Gaza at speed and at the volumes that are needed. I have, from the last few weeks, two images fixed in my mind. The first is the image of Emily Damari reunited with her mother, which I found extremely moving. The second was the image of thousands of Palestinians literally walking through the rubble to try to find their homes and their communities in Gaza. They must be allowed home. They must be allowed to rebuild, and we should be with them in that rebuild on the way to a two-state solution.
Well, that was the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, speaking in Prime Minister's Questions on the floor of the House of Commons, not asked, as predicted, by Kemi Badenoch about the situation in Gaza and President Trump's comments, but asked by Ed Davey. And Starmer reasonably clear there in making clear that the Trump position is not the British government position, saying they must be, that is Gazans, allowed to return home. We will pick over the bones of what happened at Prime Minister's Questions. That rather interesting. And let's put it this way, characteristic exchange from Kemi Badenoch and Keir Starmer on the Chagos Islands, although it wasn't really about the Chagos Islands, a weird kind of chasing of the tail. Prime Minister's Questions. We'll talk about it with Natasha Clark and get her analysis. First, though, it's Lewis Goodall here on LBC. The time is 12:19.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Time is 12:22. Well, let's just assess, shall we, what we've just heard at Prime Minister's Questions in Westminster with Natasha Clark, our political editor. It was Chagos in the end, sort of, Natasha?
Sort of. Well, she sort of started on Chagos and then sort of veered over to oil and gas, but I'm not sure it was a hugely coherent way that she did it. I think what she was trying to say is, and, you know, you heard her argument, when Labour negotiate, Britain loses out. And that was sort of what she's trying to talk about when she's trying to tie those two issues together. But she absolutely let a goal in from Keir Starmer there by not hitting back when he refused to say whether this Chagos deal is going to cost £18 billion.
Bizarre.
He deliberately did not answer that question, and she didn't pick up on it, didn't press him on it. And that's the thing about Prime Minister's questions. No matter how much you prepare, you've got to be listening to the answers that these politicians are giving in real time if you're going to really put the boot in. And she's not quite got that nailed down yet.
Well, she had an absolute open goal, didn't she, with this Chagos stuff? Because what she was able to say, look, I mean, like Starmer was very interesting in his response on it. And what was odd about it is that Badenoch sort of adverted to it, hinted at it, and then asked about something else. But then Starmer obviously took the opportunity to prepare his pre-prepared line, which was quite interesting and effective. He basically hinted at the idea that he knew something that she ought to know, and that if she did know, she wouldn't be asking this question.
Exactly.
And as a result of the fact she wasn't, I mean, she could have turned around to him and said, look, I don't need to be told anything to know that giving £18 billion to hand over territory that is already ours is a bad deal. She could have said something like that, but she didn't. But it meant that basically Starmer was able to actually sidestep it quite effectively.
Exactly. And this, it's always good when a Prime Minister can say, well, on national security grounds, you know something, I know something. There are reasons that we can't talk about, that why we need to negotiate this deal with Mauritius for the Chagos Islands. So that was obvious for anybody that was a good, strong strategy for him to go for. She didn't pick up on any of that at all. And you had this odd moment where they were sort of talking across each other, weren't they? So talking about Chagos and they were talking about oil and gas, and both sides were answering a question the other side didn't ask them. So a bit confusing, really. Lots of people online on X, sort of attacking the idea of her going on oil and gas. I don't think it's a bad idea to go on oil and gas, to go on the idea of energy, and this idea that the government are going to have to at some point make this decision on whether it was or is not lawful to go for these two new they are technically new oil and gas fields. They've not been dug up in the same way that others have.
It's going to become a bigger political issue. I think she's right about that.
Yeah, it will, but I don't think she quite nailed the question. No. I think I appreciate that, what the sort of point that she was trying to make about Labour's negotiation tactics, but, there's so many ways that she could have done that question, I think, in a better way. That Rachel Reeves obviously wants to go for growth. All of the newspapers in the last few days have been saying Rachel Reeves wants to give the green light to this because she thinks it's going to help the economy. Does this go against the spirit of the Labour manifesto, which said no new oil and gas licences? That would have been my question.
Yes, it was very hard to actually discern, in a sense, what the kind of narrative she was trying to weave about Starmer was. I mean, that she kept coming back to this line about, when Labour negotiates, Britain loses and so on. But if you're going to do that, you've got to prosecute the case. You've got to talk about it. I mean, it would have been much simpler to say, is the Times reporting correct that we're going to hand over £18 billion, to which most people listening to this, obviously not necessarily familiar with the situation in the Chagos Islands, but would seem extraordinary at a time when, as you've already said, Natasha, at a time when the government is basically trying to count every single penny.
Exactly. But two other really interesting things from Prime Minister's questions that we should definitely pick up on. Firstly, that Labour MP singling out Nigel Farage and the reform health service policy at Prime Minister's questions, which I believe was an interview that you did.
Indeed. In fact, well, let's talk about that, because it is an interesting sort of development over the last week or so. Very interesting, I thought, that Starmer and others, and what was clearly a planted question from the Labour whips, from a backbench Labour MP, decides to bring up this line that Nigel Farage in his studio said to me a couple of weeks ago, that he was open to anything on the NHS. And as soon as he said that, it's one of those moments, what it's like when you think, right, okay.
Oh no, here we go.
this is perhaps not ideal language for Farage, who, of course, has a bit of a checkered history in terms of what he thinks about the NHS, if you're someone who believes the NHS should stay as it is. Let's just listen to that exchange that Farage and I had on the question of the NHS from a couple of Sundays ago. Would you be open still to moving to, say, a French-style insurance model for the NHS?
Well, there are. I mean, the French have a mutual system. Yeah, where you pay into effectively an insurance
and
scheme.
The rich pay and the poor don't.
Yeah. And that's the mutuality. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying we should absolutely mimic the French system, but let's have a much deeper, broader thing. Wes Streeting came in as a radical on this. And I don't sense he's very radical anymore.
But you would be open, potentially, to moving to an insurance-based model for the NHS under a reform government?
If we could get a more efficient, better funding model, provided we give free care at the point of delivery, I'm prepared to consider anything.
So it's possible. You could go into that election and that election manifesto saying, let's look at a French insurance model, model, or an insurance model for the NHS.
By the time we get to the next election, we will have made our decision as to what the right route. What I'm absolutely certain of is the way we're doing it at the moment isn't working, and we're getting terrible value for money.
You don't believe in the NHS model as it currently
No, I believe. No. I believe 100%.
You believe? Free at the point of delivery. I agree.
What is the NHS for?
Yes.
What was it established for?
Well, the French model is not completely free at the point of delivery.
I know that.
Just for the point of clarity, because West Streeting has made this accusation, you're saying you're completely committed to free at the point of delivery.
Yes.
You are not committed to the model as it currently exists, and would be open, therefore, to an insurance-based model in the future.
Open to anything.
Open to anything, fine. And it was that line, open to anything, that was quoted by not only the backbench Labour MP, but Keir Starmer repeatedly, because they believe, Labour strategists, that their one real ace card against Farage, particularly in Northern and Midlands seats which could be vulnerable to reform, is his history on the NHS.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I say, they clearly have planted that question with a friendly backbencher to press Nigel Farage on this issue of the NHS and funding. And actually, Nigel Farage then stood up and which, after we cut out from Prime Minister's questions, talking specifically about this, insisting again, nope, reform does believe that the NHS should be free at the point of use. Keir Starmer then said that Nigel Farage wants to charge people for using the NHS. So they are barbing off against each other. We've got this rival Prime Minister's questions happening before our eyes. This is meant to be an opportunity for, like I say, backbenchers, for the Tories to grill, or the opposition at the time, to grill the Prime Minister. And now, it's quite clear that the Labour Party want to turn their fire on
we're going to
reform.
hear this repeatedly. And the online space, if you're living in one of those seats, in those northern seats, which they think is vulnerable, your Facebook, whatever it is, you're going to hear that clip and see that clip and other clips like it again and again and again, because, as I say, they think it is the one vulnerability. One other thing before we go, as predicted, the Prime Minister was asked about Trump's comments with regards to Gaza, not by Kevin Maidnock, but by Ed Davies. And he said, actually, I thought Starmer did put some distance between himself and the White House.
Yeah, definitely. So he's basically sort of said exactly what David Lammy said this morning, which was, that I do believe still in the two-state solution, which essentially is a slapping down of Donald Trump's comments that the US should be allowed to.
Well, he said very specifically, Palestinians must be allowed
to return home. Exactly.
And they must be allowed to rebuild, which is very much at variance with what Trump said in the White House yesterday.
He's not saying I disagree with Donald Trump. And the word on every person from Number 10's lips, they do not want to say the words I disagree with Donald Trump.
Or Donald Trump is wrong.
Donald Trump is wrong on anything. And they will not do that, I don't think, until they really, really are pressed to do so, and we are not quite at that stage yet. And like I say, Theresa May eventually got to that stage where Donald Trump said something so mad, I think it was about some far-right post that he'd retweeted on social media. She had to disown it. We've not quite got to that stage where Number 10 Downing Street, where the Prime Minister feels that he can completely say Donald Trump is wrong yet, especially while we're negotiating us out of those tariffs as well.
So Keir Starmer victory? Kemi Badenoch victory? Score draw?
I think it was a draw today. I think they both clearly enjoyed it a lot more, and I enjoyed it a lot more this week than
it's because I'm here.
Nothing against
I'm
James.
Here, of course.
No, just watching Prime Minister's question felt more entertaining. It felt like they were both getting into it. Lots of interesting topics, lots of sort of barbs being thrown around. Not a boring Prime Minister's questions, but yeah, I'd say
you can't say that every week.
You can't. Sometimes it is really dull. I don't know how much people will care or know about the Chagos Islands, but.
Well, we're going to hear a lot more about it. I think that's for sure.
It.
Natasha Clark there, LBC political editor. We're going to continue with the discussion around the Middle East for the remaining half an hour of the show and the latest thing that has emerged from Donald Trump's mind. You're listening to Lewis Goodall here on LBC at 12:31. Let's get the very latest LBC News headlines with Amelia Cox.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Is 12:35. Few of you objecting to the assessment from our very own Natasha Clark. They're saying it's a score draw between Badenoch and Starmer, saying that it was a win. I would actually probably say I agree with that. Actually, I think probably Starmer did win because he was on such a difficult position going into it, and yet somehow once again Kemi Badenoch managed to miss what should have been a pretty open goal. But there you are. You know what? It's a game of opinions, less so, of course, with regards to the Middle East and what we're seeing overnight. Our question is how it's gone down, of course, in Israel itself. Let's talk to Noga Tarnapolsky, who is the freelance journalist based in Jerusalem. Noga, thanks so much for joining us on the show this afternoon. That question, really, how has Trump's comments, how has it been received in Israel?
Well, I have to say it's provoked something like a spasm of giddy joy among the most right-wing, the most overtly racist, supremacist actors in the Israeli political sphere, who feel that Donald Trump has now given them an okay to just talk about emptying Palestinian territories, not just Gaza, also the West Bank, of all Palestinians. They feel justified to an extent that's hard for me to even describe to you.
it's given a legitimacy and a hope for them that actually this dream that they've had, their most perhaps extreme ambition, could be realised with the active connivance and assistance of the United States president.
They feel correctly that thoughts that have been beyond the political pale, beyond what's accepted in the entirety of Israeli history until really now. I mean, even those ministers of Netanyahu's very right-wing government who dared to overtly talk about removing Gazans from Gaza, it's true that they weren't reprimanded by the prime minister for saying so, but they also didn't get anything from him. And suddenly they seem to have gotten a bouquet of roses from the president of the United States. That makes the prime minister of Israel almost irrelevant, and they feel that they've been given the green light to move forward.
Do you think that this will have an effect on the ceasefire, the very, very fragile ceasefire, as it currently stands between Hamas and Israel?
It's a tricky question because, of course, it could. And the United States has been, including one member of Trump's team, Steve Witkoff, Trump's new envoy to the Middle East, actually had a part in creating this ceasefire with the Biden team. So it could, in the respect that Hamas or even the Qataris could say, the United States is not acting in good faith. They're planning on ethnically cleansing Gaza, and we can't continue. This is a farce of a negotiation. For now, it does appear that parallel to Trump's comments, both the United States and Qatar, at least, that are very powerful actors in this, and Egypt, the other important mediating nation, have an interest in this ceasefire continuing. Even if you take Donald Trump's words seriously as a plan of action, the war in Gaza has to end for him to be able to turn it into Atlantic City. And so those actors seem to want parallel action for this ceasefire to hold up, for the war to end, for the Israeli hostages to be freed, and then that would be the moment of test.
Do you think that the Middle East generally, and other countries in the Middle East outside of Israel, and indeed Palestinians in the West Bank and others, will interpret this, as has been described and suggested, as the United States endorsing a form of ethnic cleansing?
100%. And I have to tell you myself, I don't see much of any other way to see it. If the President of the United States suggests that the entire population of an entire territory could be up and shipped and enticed to leave and never to come back, as Trump emphasized last night when he was re-asked the question after his initial statements, that sounds more or less like ethnic cleansing to me. It's removing an entire population from its native area.
Do you think that there is any possibility, or do you think that is being internalized within Israel and the Middle East generally? Will it be taken seriously as a credible thing that Trump actually wants to do, or just something that Trump says he might do and forget about?
You know, we have to be really careful with this because, of course, it's virtually impossible that Trump would actually find a feasible way to remove almost 2 million Gazans from Gaza and rehouse them somewhere else. We all know this. But the fact of it having been mentioned, the fact that serious people are now permitting themselves to discuss it gleefully in a way that they haven't before, or realistically, it doesn't matter if we're talking about an Israeli minister or if we're talking about one of Trump's real estate tycoon friends. The fact that this has now been okayed as a form of public discourse, that itself changes matters. So even if Gaza is not in the end emptied of its population, as I think it won't be, and as I think is impossible, the fact that Donald Trump threw it out there in the air and that it hasn't been greeted by universal vast condemnation, that has already moved the needle on what we can talk about and what we can imagine here in the Middle East.
Is there a possibility that this has the effect of emboldening or strengthening Hamas further, because they're able to say, what's left of them in military terms, that they're able to say, look, we are the last defense for Gaza between you and ethnic cleansing, which is being orchestrated by the Americans?
Yeah, they could say this. They're in a very weak position too. Gazans know that Hamas has brought catastrophe upon them. There were really interesting scenes about 2 weeks ago now, 10 days ago. Yeah, less than 2 weeks ago, sorry. When Gazans began to be able to return home north. So those Gazans who had been displaced from the north to the south began to venture back. And there were several instances of reporters from various Arab world TV stations interviewing Gazans on foot or in vehicles returning home, and they would curse Hamas. And whenever this happened, the TV stations would go silent. So I think that Gazans, much more than anybody else on earth, know what Hamas has done. And I doubt that this will improve Hamas's power or viability. But, you know, in the kind of internet viral sphere of things, it probably does. It's a confusing moment. In the United States also, we see some of the so-called pro-Palestinian activists who suggested people should vote for Donald Trump instead of, you know, Joe Biden, who I won't repeat the insult they used against him. But now they find themselves with a president who doesn't even bat an eyelash before talking about explicitly removing all Palestinians from Palestinian territories.
Is there, do you think, I've got people now sort of messaging in, and I've had people say this morning on the show today, so, well, Trump is recognizing a reality. He's saying that that Gaza is a bomb site, that no one wants to live there, that why would anyone want to live there? Could you just explain the history, the particular history and resonance for Gazans as to why that is completely wrong, and that misunderstands the sort of people that the Palestinians are?
Yes, I think we should expand it. I think it misunderstands the sort of people most people are. In other words, I think that Donald Trump is speaking from the point of view of a transactional real estate businessman. And if you live in Malibu or if you live in Atlantic City, if you have the luxury apartment, who cares? And that's a certain point of view. And in fact, he may have been misled by people. It is entirely possible that Donald Trump received hints in recent days from people who themselves thought, let's present it to him as a real estate problem. And he would easily grasp it, and if so, they were right. But of course, it's like suggesting to Parisians who lived, you know, in an occupied city that they might want to just become Samoans because it's easier than living in occupied Paris. Or I would say the same to British people living under the Blitz at the time. Gazans and Israelis and most anybody else, whatever catastrophes befall them, feel a deep attachment to their land. For I would be stunned if there were more than a few thousand Gazans who would be voluntarily willing. Of course, their lives can be made impossible to live in Gaza. That could be part of a policy. But of their own volition, and despite the disaster that they've lived through, Gazans want to see Gaza flourish with them in it. They don't see themselves as removable peons in a larger global game. And I think, you know, all of us can identify with that.
Is just what's your what is your hunch, just finally, Noga, on, is this something, do you think, that Netanyahu will have been trying to encourage Trump to say, and a position they've tried to move him to, or is it more contingent and more random than that?
My understanding at this point is that we're all guessing here, but my understanding is that it seems likely that the idea came from Trump's son-in-law and former Mideast envoy, Jared Kushner, who for a long time now, for several years, has been speaking of Gaza in terms of a real estate opportunity. But, you know, if you looked at the images live last night, Netanyahu looked as stunned as anybody else by this proposition. He certainly didn't seem to have a prepared answer, but he didn't seem bothered. He seemed himself to be almost radiant. And so what Netanyahu understood on the spot is that Donald Trump had just given him a lifeline, a political lifeline, because if Netanyahu thought he would be returning to Israel and have to tell his most right-wing coalition members, listen, guys, there's nothing we can do. Donald Trump says we have to follow this entire ceasefire deal through. The war is going to end, and Hamas has not been annihilated. He thought he could lose his government. And instead he's coming back, and he's going to be able to pull out of his pocket this, or dangle at least, this promise and say, hey, guys, stick with me. We might get all the Gazans out. The fact that it's almost impossible to do isn't relevant on that level of political posturing. So I think Netanyahu was thrilled. I don't think he hit it, but I think he was very surprised.
Noga Tarnapolsky there, freelance journalist based in Jerusalem, giving us her assessment, marking our card for us on how all of this looks from the perspective of the Middle East itself, certainly from Israel itself. We're going to stick with this subject, unsurprisingly, for the remainder of the show. If you have any thoughts on how seriously you should be taking this, 0345 6060 973, taking all your calls all the way up, or as many as we can at least, all the way up to 1 o'clock here on LBC. You're listening to Lewis Goodall here on LBC. The time is 12:48.
James O'Brien on LBC.
And it's 12:50. Just a reminder, in terms of we've been talking about the British reaction, just a bit of context. The international world. Trump said he would be a uniter-in-chief. Well, he has. He's united pretty much every international partner against his proposal. Foreign Ministry of Egypt has said that there's no way it should happen. The Saudi Foreign Ministry has said that the international community has a duty to alleviate the severe humanitarian suffering endured by the Palestinian people, rejected it. The Russia's ambassador to the United Nations, in a sign that irony is not only dead, but might need to be exhumed from about 50 foot under, has cast themselves as a protector and guarantor of human rights by saying this is out of the question. The Palestinians don't want it. The world community doesn't want it. You can't forcefully resettle someone somewhere, apart from the Ukrainians, of course. Something to think about, Ambassador. Let's talk to Jim, who is in Kingston upon Thames. Jim.
Hi, Lewis. Big fan.
Thank you.
Just a couple of quick things, really. First of all, you as a researcher and a blogger, I'm just picking up on something your last caller mentioned. I do hope you pick up on this because everyone else has ignored it. About 9 months ago, I read that Jared Kushner had actually praised the location of the Gaza Strip as being a wonderful potential seaside resort. And I thought to myself at the time, the only thing Trump understands is real estate. And here we are. So this is not a Trump idea. This comes straight from Netanyahu, who is a big family friend of the Kushners. That's one thing. The second thing is, a lot of people have been talking about, and you've been asking the question, do we take this seriously? We have to take it seriously because this is as much America's war as it is Israel's. So the fact that Gaza is flattened, the fact that the West Bank continues to be attacked and that the south of Lebanon is being flattened and parts of Beirut, those are American ordnance and bombs and everything else.
Yes.
And the money is American money. And so if America had any will to stop this war, it would have.
And that was under the Biden administration, of course. That wasn't Trump.
It was. And that was just a kind of a weak show from Biden, who had his terrier had gone rogue and he didn't know how to stop him. But with Trump, it's a much more serious proposition.
Would you describe this, Jim, as ethnic cleansing? It's hard to see it in any other fashion, isn't it?
I would say genocide and ethnic cleansing, and they go hand in hand. A lot of the views of right-wing Israelis, when you hear them on various broadcasts... And
we should make clear that is not something shared by all Israelis by any means.
No. The extreme right-wing and the zealots, is that actually the Palestinians aren't really people. And that's an old colonial trope. Kind of the Palestinians have been subject to that for the last 100 years. I know the Jews have been subject to similar sort of things for
yes, that's
a long
sad
time.
Irony.
Yeah, and a lot of America's current involvement is after the war. America didn't want to take too many Jews, so hence the building up of the state of Israel, which they had not taken an interest in. It was the Brits who were before that, kind of vying for it. So that absolutely has to be taken seriously. And by the way, this means that kind of Russia now has a real justification to say, okay, well, you can do it in Gaza, we can do it in the Crimea. And it also means that the whole of the Muslim world, everywhere from Pakistan to Indonesia to Malaysia and beyond, is no longer going to view America as anything of an even hand in the world or anything.
Certainly not in this process. Absolutely. Jim, grateful to you. Let's talk to Joe, who's in Elstree, up in Hertfordshire. Joe.
Oh, hi, Lewis. Hi, I'll be brief. I think what Trump is doing here, he's playing 5D chess and people don't see it. Trump is taking all the heat from everybody, but he's used to this. He's done it for 10 years now, but he doesn't care. What he wants to break the cycle. He wants to break the loop of violence and war, and the only way is to stop Netanyahu from the river to the sea, because that's the Quds Charter. He wants to get rid of the terrorists. He wants to get rid of all the tunnels. And to think it's somehow unreasonable to send a group of people back to a bombed-out war zone where there is no clean water, it frankly beggars belief. And because it's Trump that says it, people start. It's so polarised.
I don't think that. I agree. Sometimes people can be hysterical with regards to Trump. I think if any American president said it would have had the same reaction, probably even more intense, because they wouldn't expect it from them.
No, but it's the way Trump delivers it, I think, in this very basic, simplistic language.
But no American president would have ever suggested, even if they'd done it in a more measured way, they would never have suggested the displacement of 2 million people.
But there is no other way out of the loop. You have to break the loop eventually. There
would be other solutions. Israel could do they could retreat from settlement. They could go into serious negotiations. There could be a two-state solution. It cannot be that the only answer is either the status quo or the forced displacement of 2 million people when they don't want to go.
Well, I think the history books will tell a different story, because I think probably 10 years from now there will be complete peace. Gaza will be rebuilt. Some
just
people,
with no Gazans living there.
No, I just said some people will return, many will choose not to, and there will be calm and peace. And we'll look back at this suggestion.
And where are all those people
going to
go? Where are all those people going to go?
Well, again, we know what happened to Canada and Mexico last week. They eventually had to bend the knee and buckle and said, "We will do as you say."
You think 2 million? You think 2 million people are going to just listen to Trump because he says they should go?
No, I didn't say 2 million. I mean, you're picking.
Well, how
a number.
many? Well, there are 2 million people there. How many do you suggest should go?
Well, I mean, you can't deal in hypotheticals.
It's not hypothetical. Trump has said it. It's not hypothetical. You're the one saying this is a work of genius. I'm asking you, how many of the 2 million do you think ought to go? I think
there'll be an option for, I think, all of them or most of them to return once Gaza is rebuilt. It has to be rebuilt. You can't have people living on a building site. It's just plain old-fashioned common sense. And if you want to say he's saying it as a business mogul, sometimes yes. Sometimes you need to have very basic 3D interpretation.
Who the hell are we, Joe? Who the hell are we to tell 2 million people that they should leave their homes and leave the place that their ancestors have lived on and go and live somewhere else?
Well, to be honest, I think there's an element of Stockholm syndrome here.
Right.
But I think people are so
Who's our kidnapper?
Well, it's the Israelis.
The Israelis are our kidnappers, but they're the ones. Right, Joe. You know what? I'd love to continue this conversation because it is taking us down many, many unexpected avenues. But I'm afraid I have to leave it there. I tell you what. Before we go, let's just leave you with another part of the Trump press conference. And if you were confused by Donald Trump, then just put yourself in the position of this Afghan journalist who managed to ask Donald Trump a question yesterday. This is what he said to her.
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
I'm from Afghanistan. My name is Afghan as a high expectation from you. Do you have any plan to change Afghanistan situation? Are you able to recognize Taliban? Because I'm an Afghan journalist, Afghan suffered woman. Any comment about Afghanistan? What's your future plan for Afghan people, especially Afghanistan?
I have a little hard time understanding you. Where are you from? Actually, it's a beautiful voice and a beautiful accent. The only problem is I can't understand a word you're saying. But I just say this, good luck, live in peace. Go ahead, please.
Well-known five-dimensional chess player Donald Trump there. Live in peace. That's what I'm going to go and do for the rest of today. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back and catch up on Global Player, of course, where you can also rewind and pause live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts, including, of course, The News Agents, which I'm off to go and record now. And we've been carrying on James O'Brien Daily whilst James is away. The best bits of this show in 60 minutes every day. Not that you'll need it, because you'll have listened to all 3 hours, I've no doubt. Download now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
Thanks very much indeed, Lewis. I'm going to return to the Middle East in just a moment, but later in the programme I want to talk about how we approach the care, the oversight of very seriously mentally ill people when they have shown already that they can be extremely violent. Would Barnaby Webber, Grace O'Malley Kumar and Ian Coates still be alive if NHS care of the severely mentally ill and violent man who killed them had been better? I think it's pretty clear that we're landing on the word yes as an answer to that question. And is care in the community, part of it anyway, is that part of the problem? I personally think the answer to that question is yes as well. We'll talk about that from 2, but first, what is Donald Trump playing at?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 1 o'clock, Palestinians have told Donald Trump to go to hell after he revealed he wants to own Gaza and transform it into the Riviera of the Middle East. The